Welcome to HTML Foundations for Web Development, where we're going to show you how to create web pages using HTML and CSS, bringing it all together to make really nicely styled web pages. My name is Lawrence and I'm going to be your instructor for this course. I've been a web developer since 1999 and I so much enjoy creating websites. It gives you so much freedom. You can apply creativity and merge it with technology to make some really cool things that people can interact with and bring it to life online. So one of the main things about creating websites is understanding the basic foundations, and that's HTML and CSS. Every single web page has HTML and most of them will have CSS. So creating and combining these two technologies together is what you need to know in order to build websites. So HTML, we're going to cover what it stands for, brief history of it, how to use it, various validators, terminology used online. So this course is going to cover everything that you need to know, including HTML, what it is, how to write it, CSS, what it is, how to write it, and also we're going to be introducing you to another core web technology called JavaScript. So there's going to be a brief introduction, although not a lot of content within the course is focused on that. We're just going to be creating an awareness that JavaScript exists and how you can bring it into your web pages and what it can do. So we're going to show you how to explore the web and show you some interesting information about websites and what you need to know about tags and elements and how they work in HTML, how attributes can apply additional information for your HTML elements and tags, and HTML, trying it out. So several different online editors that you can check out and write some HTML code directly within your browser, so not even having to download and set up your own editor. You can write some HTML code and CSS and see it working. Also, we're going to encourage you to try it out for yourself, so either in your own editor or online, showing you what to do and what not to do with HTML, so the basics of HTML, how it works, how it treats white space, single quotes, double quotes, how to create clean code, and so on. Then we're going to introduce you to the basic structure of HTML, the head, the body, and the HTML container. So basically, showing you how you can build a basic HTML template that you can use and reuse over and over again to build multiple websites and do this really easily. We're also going to look at doc type, so what doc type is, how that works, meta information, how you can use meta information to provide additional information about your web page and how that content is output, what's contained within the head of your website, and what type of tags you should include in every basic website. So there's 4 different types of tags. That's the HTML, head, title, and body should be included in every single web page. So it's not only just for SEO, although for SEO, title is super important, but it's also good practice to get into. Then we're going to look at the body, so some of the tags that are contained within the body and how we can bring attention using headings within our HTML structure, then the basics of line breaks, paragraphs, and how we can break apart our content, some of the markup that's available within HTML, so how we can make our text and differentiate our text from the context of the rest of the content being presented. So we've got a lot of options. I'm going to show you how to use those, and then divs and spans. And these are essential when you're looking at styling your web page. Gives you the ability to group that content together and apply that styling in order to make it look and present the way that you want it to present. So introducing HTML and CSS together and how they work together and what you can start doing just with a few simple statements in CSS and how you can transform the way your web page actually looks. We're going to jump back into HTML and look at the essentials of HTML. So this includes building out hyperlinks and how we can do images. So these are crucial to building any website, and understanding how to use them is super important. Also, how to organize your content, so how your HTML content can get organized in unordered lists, ordered lists, how you can nest those lists, how you can make description lists, tables, how they work, table spacing and how you apply styling to tables, and then also importantly forms. HTML forms are an important way to allow users to communicate and to submit information, and we're going to show you all the different options to build out forms. And also in the course we're going to be building out a nice contact form that you can use on your web pages. and also introducing you to JavaScript, how to bring that on the page structure, the new HTML semantic tags, and a whole lot more. Also, how you can use CSS to really customize the way your content gets output. We're going to be building out a website and going through all the different CSS to make that website look and feel like a real website and bring it to life. So your HTML code that we're working on throughout the course, how to actually make it look at the end like a website, and then customize, tweak that, and update it to make it look and feel the way that you want it to perform. This is an example of the website that we're going to be building out. And then finally, we're also going to be showing you how to add in different text to really customize how your website looks and feels. So all this and a whole lot more, and I do encourage you to work along with the course lessons. Try the code out for yourself, see what you can make happen, and check it out. Adjustments, tweak it, and see what happens. That's one of the best ways to learn. Try it out for yourself and build out your own HTML code and CSS. So when you're ready, let's get started creating HTML and CSS web pages. HTML is at the very heart of the internet and everything to do with web development. Combined with CSS and JavaScript, these are the three cornerstones of internet technology on the internet today. And HTML is where the very base of creating websites is founded on. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It describes basically what the browser outputs onto the web page. So it's a set of instructions that the browser uses in order to render out the content as designed from the HTML coding. And then for the CSS, it helps stylize and present that content to you, and JavaScript then helps create interaction within that content and also ability to create dynamic content as well. And you may be wondering what the difference is between HTML and HTML5. So HTML5 is essentially the latest version of HTML. Previously with HTML4, it was always just called HTML, so there was no differentiation. And with HTML5, there was a lot of brand new advancements. So it's a big step forward, and that's why you'll hear HTML and sometimes it being referred to as HTML5 for the latest version of HTML. So now with HTML5, we've got better support for audio, video, and interactive graphics, as well as HTML5 has some newer elements and more advanced functionality, including offline data storage. So in order to create HTML, there are validators, and there's a consortium called the World Wide Web, so WWW, and this is an international community of member organizations, and they help guide the development of web technologies such as HTML. So they've got a formatting checker at validator.w3.org. And when you go over to validator.w3.org, this is where you can check to make sure that your documents are valid HTML, XHTML, which is a more stricter format for HTML, and there's a few other formats here that you may or may not have heard of, and it allows you to validate them according to the web address. And there's also a validator for RSS feeds. So these are feeds that are used in order to syndicate simple content that's published on a regular basis, such as blogs, news, headlines, and so on. And also at W3C, you can, or w3.org, you can find out basically what's new with HTML, what's happening, and what's new on the web, what kind of changes are up and coming, any changes, and syntax that needs to be updated, and all of the different updates. So they've got also various cheat sheets here. So there's a cheat sheet here for HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Here you can look up various elements, see HTML elements, and it gives you more information on those elements and so on, as well as accessibility and typography. Essentially a lot of information over here, and again back to the validator, so we could take a URL and we can check to make sure that the HTML is valid, and if it's not valid then it'll give us a summary here of different errors or issues that it finds and what should be corrected within our HTML. There are quite a few of these useful tools online in order to help you write better HTML code. A little bit more on terminology that's used in the web. So we've got HTTP, which is different than HTML because HTML is the markup language and the HTTP is the transfer protocol. So whenever you go to your favorite websites, you see that it always starts with this HTTP. Sometimes it's HTTPS for a secure page. And basically that means that this is the transfer protocol that is being used to transmit that data communication throughout the web. So basically what's happening when we go to a website, that the website files are sitting on a server and we access that website address. It returns back a set of files that are sitting on the folder, and your browser interprets those files, reads them, and renders them out as visible and interactive content for web users. And that's the one good thing about HTML and when creating HTML code is that all you need is a browser to render out your HTML. And I'm going to show you that in the upcoming lesson, how we can write some HTML code on our computer and view it within our browser. And then lastly, so we already looked at HTML, so hypertext markup language. So essentially it's a markup language that the browsers use in order to display content. And then URLs, so these are uniform resource locators. So they're essentially used to reference the address of a website. So when we go over to a web page, we can see that the URL of the web page, so it's included here at the top. So it comprises the domain and essentially the path on the internet in order to access that content that you're looking for that's tied to the server content. And then also briefly what we already have covered, that there's HTML5, so again the latest version of HTML, so it gives you better HTML, more dynamic content. There's CSS, so these are Cascading Style Sheets, and right now CSS is on its 3rd version, so sometimes you might see CSS 3 along with HTML5. So basically that's working and using the current version, and it's the presentation part of your web page, basically how the content is presented to the user, and the content is structured using HTML, and then CSS helps you present that content and helps the web browser determine what that content should look like. So for instance, background colors, font colors, different font styles, and a whole lot more, including positioning of various elements that you've created within your HTML code. And JavaScript is essentially what brings your web content to life. So JavaScript is dynamic and interactive, so it can actually change that HTML output and change your CSS via the JavaScript and alter it and present it in different ways to your web users. So if you have, for instance, you're displaying hello world on your HTML page, well, you can take that hello world and you can change it in JavaScript and update that text right within JavaScript. So in the next lesson, we're going to be looking and we're going to be exploring the internet, and we're going to start by looking at how we can create HTML code and how markup language works, separating out content and presenting it within your web browser. So that's coming up in the next lesson. In this lesson, we are going to jump in and start creating a website. So essentially, if you want to create a website, the simplest websites can be created with 8 tags and 4 pairs of tags. So that's HTML, head, title, and body. And essentially, that's what HTML is. It's a set of these bracketed values that are contained within brackets, and this is what we call tags within our HTML coding. So anything that's between these less than and greater than symbols is where we've got the tag, and then tags, a lot of times tags are paired. So we'll have an opening tag such as the body that's demonstrated, and then we have some content and then the closing tag. And there are also what's called self-closing tags. So these are HTML elements that open the tag. They have some attributes, content that makes that tag specific, pulls in specific information into that tag, and then it closes itself off. So there's no room to place any additional content in between the tags. So essentially two types of tags within HTML, just regular tags and then paired tags, and then the self-closing tags. And also, I've also included here that archive.org. So this is just a fun place where you can type in your favorite websites and you can see what they looked like over the years. So this has an internet archive of all the different websites, over a lot of the different websites, and throughout the years they archive it, and you can see what it actually looks like in. So if I want to see what Yahoo looked like in 2000, I can click it here, and you see there's a few instances here, started in 96 when they started doing the tracking, and you can see that when we take a look at it, we've got a lot of choices here of what we want it to look at. So we can select any one of these dates, and it's even got times there for the different snapshots, make a selection, and we can take a look at how web development has changed over the years. So we see that initially in 2001, so I guess this example is from 2001, June 6, 2001, there's a whole bunch of just links, there's a lot of text heavy content, and throughout the years the internet has changed quite a bit. So this is always a really cool resource to kind of take a look and see the different web design styles and what's changed throughout the years. And this is a resource that has, it's also known as the Wayback Machine. So now it's housed at archive.org. So you can take a look around and type in your favorite websites, and if they've got an archive of it, then you'll be able to see what they actually looked like. And every website, going back even to these original sites, it's all styled the same way. So if you've got your browser open, I've got Chrome open, you can, on a Windows machine, you can press Control U, and you see that we've got all of the code is contained within these HTML tags. So we always start out with the opening HTML, we've got the opening head, we've got the title there, closing title, we've got some JavaScript in there, some styling in there, and then we've got the rest of the content, so styling it all within HTML. So every web page contains HTML, and HTML is how that structure of the website is basically presented and how your browser knows what to render out. So in order to type HTML code, we don't actually need anything fancy. Chances are you already have something on your computer that you can create HTML pages with. So on a Windows machine, you might have Notepad, and you might have various other applications, even Word, well, anything that you can open up and you can just create any type of file. So if I do something like hello world, and if I save this as an HTML page, then this is actually going to be rendered out, can be rendered out via my browser. Even though I haven't included any HTML tags, the browser will understand that if I'm saving a file as an HTML file, then it tries to render that out within the browser. Of course, this is a lesson on HTML, so we're going to skip that part about just typing out text, and I'm going to show you how to properly create an HTML page. So again, first thing that you need is an editor. So you can use a number of different editors and that you might have on your system at the moment. And if you are looking for an editor, there's a number of really good ones online. So that includes Brackets.io. So this is an Adobe product. It's a free open source editor. So you could download that and install that on your computer. So I actually have a version of Brackets already installed. So I'm going to do part of the course creating content within Brackets. And also, if you're looking for just a resource online to type some quick HTML, you can use CodePen.io, and there are a number of other resources out there. that you can utilize, and you can see here that I am typing some HTML code, so basically a paragraph. And the really cool thing about CodePen.io is that once you create that content, it immediately gets rendered out in the display area, and you can actually see what that HTML code is doing and how it gets rendered out within the browser. So you get a really quick preview of the code that you're working on as you're writing it out. So the choice is yours. There's a number of different ways to practice and try out HTML. So in order to create it, let's open up our editor. I'm going to open up Brackets, and this again available for download at brackets.io. So if you do want to use the same editor I'm using within the course, then this is the one, and it's available free to download. So I'm going to open up Brackets, and I'm just going to create a brand new file. So right now we've just got a brand new file, haven't saved it. I've got a folder called app2 that I'm going to save this file within, and let's create some HTML code. We did see earlier where I created paragraphs, so we'll just do that again, and we'll do hello world within the paragraph tags. And we're going to go ahead and save this file. We're saving it to our app2 folder, and we'll just call it index.html. So make sure that you're saving the file type as all files and index.html. So usually we do use index because this is the starting point to a folder structure on your domain. So you can actually call it whatever you want as long as you're giving an extension of HTML, or you can also use a short format HTML. So this is also renders out HTML code, but we're just going to keep it at HTML for now. Save that, and we see that now we've got an HTML page saved on our computer. When I open it up here within my folder structure, I can see I've got index.html, and now I can open it up in my browser. Double click it, I open up index, and as we can see, the browser is able to run that code and display it within the browser window. So you're probably looking at this and saying, okay, well, this is maybe a little bit too simple because this does not look exactly like we would expect from an HTML page, because as we've shown when we open up various HTML page, when we look at the source code, it's got quite a lot more structure to it than just opening paragraphs and closing paragraphs. And so now we're going to add that in as well. We're going to start by, so this would be the content that we want to present to the user. So this would be within our body content. So the first thing we want to do is open up our HTML and have a closing tag HTML. So opening tag HTML, closing tag HTML. And then next we want to create a head section. So this is where all of our meta information will sit, any information that is going to be relevant in order to help the browser render out that page. And then after that, we're going to create body, and then this is where all of our visible content for our web users is going to go. It's going to sit within body. And one other tag that I did mention within this resource, so we've got HTML head, title, and body. So these are what the tags that are required for even the simplest pages. So we're going to also add in title. And what title essentially does is it's important for SEO, and also it helps structure the web pages, that every web page has a title, and you can see it within your browser here up here in the top here in the tabs, and most web pages will include the title, and it is really important for SEO purposes. So again, that title is what gets displayed here. This is the part that's actually visible to the web user, that when they see the tab, they have it displayed in the title. And when we say it is important for SEO, this is also sometimes what Google will use when it represents your page within the search results. So it also bolds it and links to it. So having a really good title and a title relevant to the content of the web page is super important. And also try to make them unique. So titles should be unique. And this is actually brackets that's closing off the tags for me. So I've got opening tags, and it's actually closing those off for me. And if you're not using brackets, if you're using Notepad or any other one, generally you probably don't have the self-closing turned on, so you won't be closing off the tags, but these are all paired tags, so it's got an opening and a closing. So HTML opens, HTML closes, head opens, head closes, title opens, title closes, body opens, body closes, and paragraph opens and paragraph closes. So this is a very basic HTML page, and when I save that, and if I take a look at that web page right now, we don't see anything different, but when we look at the source code, we've got a properly structured HTML page ready to go, and in order to add in even more content. So in the next lesson, we're going to look a little bit deeper into tags and elements, see how they work, and I'm going to introduce you to some more tags and elements that you can use within your HTML pages. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at tags and elements, definitions of tags and elements, and we're going to dive deeper into our web page, our HTML document that we are creating. So essentially, we looked previously, we saw that we've got a number of different tags, and when we've got an opening and a closing tag, and all together, this is what's known as an element. So everything here that's contained within it, so this is the entire element, and these are just the tags alone. So that's how to differentiate between tags and elements. So when we use them in definition, when we've got all of that content that's between there, then that's between the starting and closing tag, including the tags, that's the element. So another thing that HTML tags might have and that you might see are attributes. So we see here in this example that we've got a paragraph tag, and we've got within that opening and closing bracket of that P tag, we've got additional information. And these are what's known as attributes. They help distinguish and provide additional styling and output information for various elements within your web HTML page. So let's go ahead and try this out for ourselves, and what we're going to do is add in a title here and just call it our open text, or maybe we could call it our opening text. And see, it goes right before we close off, so we've got our tag, and now we've added in this attribute called title, and we're just doing equal sign. Notice that it is bracketed, so we are quoting around it, so to keep everything contained, self-contained, and that we can distinguish what part of the attribute is meant as the value of the attribute. So we've got the title property, and the value is going to be opening text. So let's take a look at our page now and refresh it, and we see that we've got that same hello world, but notice as I'm hovering over it, I've got this little tooltip that's popping up that says opening text. So notice that little square box there that says that information. And I think I had to screen capture that because I don't think that opening text was showing very well within the display area here. So essentially it's giving you this, and this is what the attribute is doing. It's giving us some additional output and display information for our HTML code. So that's how title works. And we had also shown another attribute here within our PowerPoint. That one was style. So essentially what this does is this gives us styling options, so CSS options directly as attributes within the element. So let's copy out our paragraph, and I'm going to add another one here. Instead of title, I'm going to use style. And then instead of opening tag, I'm going to give it a background color. So we're going to do background and background color. And the color, maybe the background color that we want to use is blue. So just save that and go back out to our elements there, and we see that now this one is has something visibly happening to it where the background of the element, so we've got that entire paragraph element that takes up the full width of the screen, available screen size, that displays the background color as blue. So that's what attributes can do. They can add in additional information into our web page. And also, if you're looking to try out, so we did show you CodePen. There's also jsfiddle.net and jsbin. So these are other online editors that you can use in order to get familiar with typing HTML. So you can see that when we go to our CodePen example, and if I add in some attributes here, so if I do style, and I'm going to equal the style to background color, and we'll do red for this example, we see that one goes red. I can also do a number of other styles here, so I'm going to just copy and paste that in, and maybe for this one we'll do color. So instead of background color, we'll just do color, and that will change the color of the output text, so it turns blue there. And there's a number of other ones that we are going to be looking at in more depth as we progress through the course. So essentially this gives us the ability to apply styling onto our web page. And I do encourage you to either open up an editor on your computer or go to one of these online resources and try it out for yourself and see what you can do with HTML. And as we introduce more tags throughout the course, try them out as well and see what they do, see what happens when you apply these elements. So we can see that we've been working with the paragraph tag, and what the paragraph is actually doing is that it has some formatting to it. So we see that we've got hello world, and the hello world, now that we've gotten a background of red on that entire element, we see that it actually spans the entire width of the page. There is some formatting here where it's got spacing between them, so this is a lot different than if I was just to type hello world, hello world, hello world. We would see that this would all just be one line of text. So just save that there. And we see that there is no distinction, there's no spacing between the hello worlds. So this is all inherent within those paragraph tags, and this is what HTML is all about. It's about writing that content, but creating some additional structure to that content, so when it gets rendered out, it's not just all one big blob of text. You have some structure, and when you go over to the code, you're able to differentiate which the different paragraphs and different parts of the code. And CodePen also has this tidy HTML, so you can tidy up your formatting of your HTML code as well directly within the CodePen editor. And so one of the things to note about CodePen is that this simply writes into the body. It automatically attaches the CSS and JavaScript directly into that page, and we don't have any of the meta information available. If you do need to add some additional meta information, so if you've got head stuff here, you can add it in here, insert the most common meta tags. So we've got common meta tags here, and we can add in a title for it and a description and tags and so on, but we don't have those typical HTML opening, head opening, closing, body opening and closing, because all of that coding area is just that body area, and then you can apply different head information as well into it. So additional to opening and closing HTML, I also want to specify that when we are writing HTML, in order to do it properly, so you can see that when you go to web pages and you see, so if you open up the source, you see that they always start out with doc type. And so this is an essential way of writing HTML, because this is what actually specifies what type of document the web browser can expect. So even though it's got an HTML extension, it's always better to be specific and let the browser understand that this is going to be a modern HTML5 document. So this is how we specify the latest HTML version, where we just do doc type HTML, and this is understood by the browser that now it can expect HTML content here, and more specifically HTML5 content. So we also looked at attributes. So with attributes, you can provide even more specific information to the browser again. So within the HTML tag, there's an attribute called lang, so that's short for language, and this is also used by the search engines and the browsers in order to better understand what language of content can be expected within the web page. We can also, or we should also, specify our character set so that depending on the languages that we're using, and we might have specific character sets that are specific to our web content, and this is where we use the meta tag. And the meta tag has an attribute called character set, and right now we're going to use the UTF-8 character set. And so this helps once again the browser understand what type of characters to expect and what should get rendered out here within the page. So if there's any question about it, we've got that information handy and it's all ready to go. So I'm just removing out some of the spacing there. And essentially this is a great starting point for any HTML page where you've got the character set, you've got the title, you've made some more specific information, and really when you go over to the web page, you're not going to see anything really different, but it is important to include this information within the source code in order to be writing your HTML files properly. So in the next lesson, we're gonna cover off some do's and don'ts when you're writing HTML code. So that's coming up in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're gonna look at some do's and don'ts with our HTML code. So previous lesson, we showed you how we can create a default HTML template. So it's got all of the characteristics that we would expect within an HTML page. We've got our doc type specified. We've got a language HTML tag. So that HTML opening tag has a language attribute. We've got some meta information, a character set. We also have a title. So opening head, closing head, body opening, body closing, and then we've got our content here, and then this is what would be changing. So if we use this as a basic template, then this is where we would be changing and updating our content to present different content within different pages, and then we could save this as a different named HTML page and have more HTML pages that we've created from this initial template. So some of the do's and don'ts, we worked with paragraph tags, and one of the things to remember with paragraph tags, even though you can nest tags typically one within another, paragraph tags are actually a no-no. So you shouldn't be nesting one paragraph into another, even though it will technically let you and it will output it, but the output is going to be a little bit strange and not what you would expect. So we see here that I've got hello, and I've got the world and the second world here within paragraph tags, and then I've got the last world there, and we see that this, although it works and it produces the 4 different paragraphs, we've only specified 1, 2, 3 different tags. So essentially we've got this hello and that hello. It looks like it's broken apart in the different paragraph, and that's why we don't use it, because it does add to the confusion. So if we want to have this type of output being displayed within our page, then we would use paragraph, 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 paragraph for each one of these elements. So that's just something to keep in mind when you are creating tags, that do not nest paragraphs into other paragraphs. And also when you are using tags, make sure that you're not overlapping closing tags. So if you've got something like this, and maybe this one is a heading, so make sure that I'm not using an overlapping closing tag. So make sure that if I've opened something up within the paragraph, that I'm also closing it up before I'm closing off the parent element tag. So make sure that proper formatting would be that I would have this H1 and it would be sitting within the paragraph, and then the paragraph could potentially be sitting in a div, which is sitting in a body, which is sitting in an HTML. So they all get nested one into the other, and when you are nesting them, make sure that these tags are kept separate and they're not overlapping. Also make sure that you write clean code, so that means indenting the code. So this is something that we saw originally in CodePen when we do the tidy HTML, and it tidies up our HTML, keeps the paragraphs on separate lines. We also see that here within brackets where we've got the different tags opening and closing, and we've got the indentation of the nested tags, the nested elements that are within the parent. And this gives us a more visually easier formatting to read of our HTML code. But white space with HTML, so actually tags, they're not case sensitive, but usually by default we do use lowercase. So you can for instance do body uppercase, but we see that when we write it in uppercase, it really messes up the way the content flows, and it doesn't look well, it doesn't get presented well. So best practice is usually to keep them as lowercase and keep them the same. When it comes to white space, so only one space is being returned within white space. So if I've got hello world and within my source code I put a ton of space here, and when I actually render out the page and take a look at it, I'm going to see that it actually doesn't change. So we don't have all of that spacing in there that you would expect when you're looking at the source code. And maybe a better example is you can see it here, and then when I refresh it, nothing actually changes because that one space is the same as multiple spaces. So all we get is just one simple space there instead of having multiple spaces. That would be something that we might expect within our HTML. And again, it is best practice when you are writing your code, tidy it up, and we see that those white spaces get removed because they're not actually doing anything other than taking up space within our source code, and it's not affecting the way the content gets rendered out. Also, when you're using quotes, so within the attributes, when you're using single or using double quotes, you can use either one of those, but they need to match. So you can't have something where you've got a single quote starting and then closing it off with a double quote. That's not going to work. You can do both single quotes if you want, or you could do both double quotes as we've shown you in the example. So those are just things to keep in mind when you are writing your HTML. So in the next lesson, we're going to jump back into the structure of the page and go over that in a little bit more detail. So it's coming up in the next lesson. So let's do a quick review of what we've learned in the previous lessons. So we looked at HTML and we saw how it allows us to structure our content in order to get presented to our web users via the browser. We saw that there was also 4 essential HTML tags that we need to have in any proper HTML structured document. So we had the opening HTML tag, and this is the main root element for HTML. It's the main container of all of your web content, and it's the main element. So this is the main parent element to your head and to your body content. The head is where meta information sits about the document, contains important information used by the browser, and it's actually not meant to be displayed to the users. The title tag, of course, is visible, but essentially it's a set of instructions meant for the browser in order to help render out that web page. So any important information, and we saw that we included things like the meta for the character set within that head section. And we also included the title of the web page. And so body is where all of the contents you want to output to your web user. So this is where all of that content that you want to present to your web user gets rendered out. So essentially, if you are creating a web page, very simple web page, and as in our example, we can see that we've got the document type being declared, we've got HTML, we've got body, and then when we add in the head there, then we've got the title as well. And here's some brief definitions of what they do. And also, we didn't look at the H1 tags, but we did write one in the previous lesson. So these are heading tags, and these are meant to highlight content. So they can be contained within your paragraph, and again, it's content that is going to be more visible within the web page. It's going to really make that content stand out, and it's also very useful for SEO purposes, because when the search engines are looking at your web page, they say, wow, this word really stands out, or this set of text really stands out, and that's because it's carrying that H1 tag, and it's meant to highlight that content. And H1s also have some properties here where we see that it differentiated. It kind of treats it the same way as paragraphs, where we get this breakdown and we get this differentiation and splitting of that content. So also within the meta information, so within that top information, we specified that we've got a language type as an attribute, and we also specified doc type. So essentially it tells the browser what type of HTML they can expect on the web page. We also specified the character set for encoding, and here's another one that is commonly included within web pages, and probably typically if I go into any web page and if I view the source code, I see this viewport within the meta tag. And essentially what the viewport does is, so I'm going to include that within my template, because with having access to mobile devices and multiple size screens, this is where the viewport comes into play, and it allows you or your web browser to better render out that content depending on the size of your display area. So basically the width of the viewport is set to be the device width, so whatever device width it is, if it's 100%, and then it scales it to a scaling of a 1. So initial scale is 1, and it's set to 100% of the available width within the device. And this is what the viewport does within our web pages. We also have, if we're linking out, so the initial scale is 1, so this is, or 1.0, and that's the zoom scale of the screen. So we also have styling tags that we can add in, and this is different than the style attribute. So if I wanted to apply styling to my entire page, I can do it within a set of style tags. So you'll also see this as very commonly done within web pages where we've got our styling or we've got a link to the styling. So that's another way that you can access styling information and keep that within the head of your web content. See, when we go over to the brackets IO, so we're linking out to the style sheets, so it's got a listing of all the style sheets. There's that viewport, so it equals the device width, and it's got a bunch of other meta information here. So this is open graph information for Facebook, so it's got page content, and this is essentially what Facebook will pick up and display within their shared content when you share this web page. It's also got Twitter information, Twitter header information, and again, this isn't meant for consumption by the user coming into the page, but it is meant for when the page gets shared on Twitter or gets shared on Facebook, it knows what image to associate, what description we want used, or the web page wants used, and what title needs to be used. And then there's some more styling information here, and then we've got the style tag. So the style tag allows us to apply styling, so we can select various elements. So I'm going to just select the H1, and I'm going to give it a color of red, and we'll see that when I go out to the web page, our H1 tag now outputs our text as red, and this is what styling does. So instead of having to add it within the line, now if I have any other H tags, it will apply that same styling to it. So now if I go out and if I refresh it, all of my H1 tags are going to now have a color of red and any additional styling that I add in. So this is CSS, and we are going to be covering more of this in the latter part of the course. So another thing that you might commonly find within the top is the link out to the style sheet. So that's what we've got here. So a lot of times when you're developing your website templates, you might not want to have to repetitively update the style or within the attributes, and you might want to just simply link out to a style sheet. And this is also commonly done, so we could copy the styling information, create a brand new page, and we could save it as a CSS file. So I'm going to just call it style CSS. And then instead of having it here, I can use a link tag. So it's link rel. So that's the type of link that we can expect. So this is a style sheet. And then the location of where the style sheet is located. So we've got it within that same root directory as index. So that's where style is, and then we just close that off. And now whenever I go out to the web page, we still get that same styling information. Although it's not contained within the page, it's doing the same job as being on the page, but it's linking out to this file. And this is a lot more advantageous if you're creating a multiple page website where you might, for instance, want to update all of your H1 tags. So instead of red, you want to change them all to blue. And if you've got index and you've got maybe 10 other pages, all linking to the style sheet, you can just go in that one place and you can update the color really easily, save it, and then that would propagate all throughout all the different pages that are using that particular style sheet for styling of those HTML pages. And that's the real advantage of linking out to style sheets, and that's why we see that very often within source code, where we're linking out to numbers of different style sheets, and all of these are formatted so whatever page we want the styling information to be transcribed to, we simply link out to it here within the head section. And then if we want to use that styling information, we can also do combinations. We can link out to multiple style sheets. We can include the style on the page itself, and we can even do the attributes as styling within the pages. So all depending on how you're developing your website. And so lastly, we also want to talk about title. So this is very important for SEO purposes to indicate the content and the title of the page. And it's also one of the most basic website, because these are, again, the 4 tags that can form the most basic type of website. And then next is the body, and this is again where all that visible content goes. And as we've seen, that this is where the bulk of our HTML should be sitting, and this is what we want to output to our web users, and we want them to see when they come to our website. And we see that once we hit body, this is where all of that HTML sits. So typically you have a ton of HTML tags and elements that are contained within there. And we also had briefly looked at headings. So headings come in 6 different sizes, H1 being the largest all the way down to H6, and basically used to highlight and bring attention to text. And this is what HTML is about as well. When you're creating your HTML pages and you're using your tags, you determine before you apply the tag what parts of the content and the text you want to highlight and what parts you want to structure and break apart, and then you apply the HTML tags accordingly. So headings come in the 6 different sizes. So I'll just show you what they look like. So we can have the 6 different heading sizes, and we can do a comparison. And typically when you are using H1 tags, you should only be using them once. So you shouldn't be using H1 multiple times as I am doing in the page. The structure typically is that you have one H1, so this is the main heading of your web page, and then any subsequent headings are H2 headings. Any headings within the H2s would be 3s. Any additional subsequent headings 4, 5, 6, all the way down to 6. And you very rarely actually see 6 within the web page. So I know this might be a little bit deceiving because I've zoomed in 250%, but we can see the scaling of the heading information as compared to the regular text on our page. So we see that heading 1 is about twice the size, heading 2 is about 1.5 the size, heading 3 is just slightly bigger, heading 4 is pretty much the same size but bolded, and then heading 5 is actually smaller than our main text, and then heading 6 is even smaller. And this again, you very, very rarely see any web pages even going past heading 4. For the most part, you see heading 1, heading 2, and occasionally a heading 3, and very rarely a heading 4 within a web page. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at that structuring and how we can create paragraphs and line breaks and how they get formatted within our text. So that's coming up in the next lesson. This lesson, we want to introduce you to some brand new tags, and these will also help structure your web page and essentially help you determine how your content gets output and spaced within the contents of your web page. So we've got paragraph tags that we had looked at earlier. So this is just the P. So opening and closing tags. This is our paired values. And again, don't place the paragraph within another paragraph. And there is some default styling that gets added to the paragraph elements. So this gives it some spacing around the different paragraphs, and we saw that in the earlier examples where they're not just stacked one on top of the other. So what happens if you actually want the content to be right one next to the other? So in this case, I'm going to use CodePen here. So if I had a number of words here and I was looking at this and I said, okay, well, I actually want this one to start a new line, but I don't want it to be a paragraph. I don't want to separate it out, and I don't want this formatting and styling. So this is easy enough to do with a line break. So this is just a BR tag, and notice that this is a self-closing tag. So these ones are self-closing, and we don't need any a closing tag. We just got the BR, and that does the work because it's applying specific formatting into the page. So BRs are line breaks, and they allow us to break apart those contents without applying any additional formatting to those pages. So line breaks, and there's also a horizontal rule. So basically HR will create a horizontal rule across the page. So if we use an HR, we see that we get this horizontal line, and with the HR there is some padding here where we've got some spacing between the different elements here, or the different text content, so it's still within that one element, but we've got some spacing between the different text areas. So we've also got PRE, so this is used for pre-formatted text. So for instance, if I had some pre-formatted text, I could use this as PRE, and we see that the formatting of the text is slightly different than the rest of the surrounding text. So these hello worlds are slightly different, and that's because the PRE. So it allows you to, again, differentiate that content and pull it out and make it look different within your web page. So markup is what HTML is all about, and of course it's within the very definition of HTML. So we're going to look at some additional markup in the upcoming lesson, and again, how you can present that text in multiple ways by applying some HTML markup to those elements. Wrapping your text with various markup in order to present it differently. So that's coming up in the next lesson, and we're going to be reviewing a bunch of different really simple markup that you may or may not use, but it's just really good to understand that it's available and what it does within our web page output. So that's coming up in the next lesson. This lesson is going to focus on markup. So we're going to be reviewing various markup that's available within HTML, and I'm going to be showing you what it does on the output side and how it presents itself within our HTML page. So we saw in the last lesson we introduced the pre-formatted text, or the PRE, and we saw when we added that within Hello World, it formatted and made it look slightly different. So let's go through all the different elements here, and I'll show you all the different ones and all the different things that it can do. So we've got Hello World there within the paragraph. We've got the Hello World here within the PRE. So I'm going to get rid of that. And next we want to look at small. So just to show you what happens when we've got small, and small again, it's opening small and closing small. And I've got the hello world in there, and we can see the output here on the right hand side. So small is actually getting pretty small there, and I should actually add in that HR, so the horizontal rule, so that we can separate that out, and we can see that this one here is the small. So maybe I should even write small or something like that, so we can see it in the output here. So again, the output here is being output here on the right hand side, and as I'm typing in the content here on the left hand side. So next one that we want to look at is mark. So what mark does is it basically allows us to highlight that content. So this is mark, and that's hello world with mark around it. So it's highlighted, and we notice also it's important to see that it's only the paragraph one here that actually splits it apart. So this hello world with mark and hello world with small, they don't have any additional formatting, so it's not taking up that full line of code, and this is just regular inline styling being applied to it, so it's not actually breaking it apart and creating a new paragraph. And that's one of the differences between this markup is, and all the different markup will behave in different ways. So we might want to do something where we've got the line break here at the end, so that we actually do have it on different multiple lines. So next we looked at mark. So we've got delete, and delete allows us to do a line through the various through the elements content. So we get that line through the content there. Maybe what I can do is I can erase the rest of this stuff, so it's not leading to any confusion there. So we've got a line through it there. We've also got a subscript. So subscript, and subscript will move it up, and maybe this one is a good example of something that should be in line. So just do hello world like this. So some of them, in order to illustrate it, you do need to be a little bit more creative with your content there in order to illustrate it. And we see that the subscript, so we've got hello world here, but sub, and this is within the sub element, it brings it down there. So it splits it apart and makes it underneath wherever the typical flow of the content would be. There's also sup. So sub is down and sup is up. So this one brings it up there. So you see it brings it to the very top of the line height for our HTML output. We also have a block quote. So this is one that maybe we can do with some content in here. So this is block quote. And again, it's not really important to memorize all the different ones, but it is important to be aware of what you can do with simple HTML, so we don't have to apply any formatting. And notice that what block quote does is essentially makes it look like it's output here and it's completely block and so on. So that's some of the markup, and there is quite a bit. We've got additional markups, so we can bold text, create an italic, underline, strike through it, and we did small, so we can do big as well. So let's take a look at those. So let's maybe do, so we did small over there, and let's do big. So small makes it smaller, and big, and you guessed it, if you said big, we'll make it big. And that's one thing that's really good about HTML. A lot of the tags are, there's semantics, so there's meaning behind what the tags are. I know that P doesn't necessarily indicate that it's a paragraph, but ones like small and big are very evident what is going to be output there within the content. So the bolded one, so the B, and so this is just a bolded text, so B opening and B closing. So I want to do it within this type of format so we can see within the flow of the text. And I'm just adding in the space there. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to bring it to the top for the next ones. So we've got italic, so I've got the bolded one there, and this one is italic. So what it's going to do, it's going to make the text slightly slanted. So we've got our text, so now we're looking over here, and we've got bolded, we've got italic, and another one is underline. So this one is another simple one to understand. So it's going to basically underline that selected text. So underline, we see that it puts the line underneath that selected text content. We've got strike as well. So strike, what strike does is it's going to strike through the word. So see that right away, it does that strike through the content. And I should just update this to strike as well. So striking through the word, underline, italic, bold, and these are a lot of examples of what we've got available to us. So we notice that some of them are very similar. So delete is very similar to strike, and it's just a matter of the semantics and how you would intend to use it within your structure. So also there's phrase tags. So there's emphasize, content, and strong. So these are very, very similar to what you saw in italic and bold. So it's just another way of outputting it. We've got acronyms, quoted, cite, and code. So let's take a look at those really quickly within our code pen. So let's just jump down here, and so we did strike, and next, instead of strike, let's change that to emphasized. So again, very similar to italic, emphasized, and really there's not that much of a difference. When we look at italic, we look at emphasized, it literally outputs the same way. So it's just a matter of semantics and how you intend that text to be taken and understood. So strong and bold, they look the same, but they are different within the wording there. So strong is going to look bolded, but if you do want to highlight text, then bold it. If you want to be strong within your content, then use strong. So the search engines and the browsers will definitely understand them differently. So even though to the naked eye they are looking the same, there's acronym. So I'm going to just copy and paste this in. This is just to give you an idea of what this looks like. There's not a whole lot there, not a whole lot of differentiation between the words. There's quoted, so quoted for a Q, and we see that it puts quotes around. So without having to include the quotes, it does the quoting for it, so it quotes that content that has the Q around it. There's cite, so this is used when you want to cite particular text within other text, and we see that the cite, so quoted and cite, so it looks a little bit like the italic and the emphasized. So it's again, it's slanted, it's a little bit lighter. And then lastly, so there's code, and code outputs it in a different font, more of a code kind of blocky type font. So you see that code is written out as more blocky text and content. So that differentiates again from the different the rest of the wording and string content that's around that various selected element. And so we see coded there, a little bit different. So slight differences, and it's just important to understand that these are all available when you are writing out your HTML. Try to format it properly within the structure of the code. So even though if you do want it to look different, like you want a red background or blue text, you can apply that within the styling. You can also apply italic text, and you can make it bolded as well within the styling. But when you are trying to emphasize it and you want it being presented within your HTML document, it is best to present that within this type of format directly within the source code of the HTML page. And again, I do encourage you to try it out for yourself. You don't need to memorize all these different tags. This is just simple markup tags. You won't probably be using a whole lot of them. Typically, you're using bold, and you might be using the the emphasized, and then again, depending on what your needs are, you might use some of the other ones, but it's very rare that you'd be using so many different types of markup within your HTML document. So try it out for yourself. Check it out on CodePen or other editors and see what you can do and see what you can produce within your HTML code. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at how we can group content together in order to prepare for being able to select it using CSS. And there are two main elements that we use within HTML to group content together, and those are divs and spans. And spans essentially give you inline effect, whereas a div creates a brand new block quote. So let's go take a look at, open up our editor, and we'll take a look and see what that looks like when we copy that code out into our HTML. So here we can see that we've got some content, we've got our div content here, and we've got some span content. And the difference is that the div content, so if we multiply this several times, we can see that the divs take up that full line of code. So it is different than paragraphs, because paragraphs again have that additional styling that's attached to those elements. And we can see that when we take a paragraph, so I'm just going to use blind text generator in order to generate a few paragraphs of content and make them really small. And select all, and I'm going to copy that into my CodePen so that we can take a closer look at it. And we can see that with paragraphs, they allow us to group that content, but they still add in that additional styling. So let's say, for instance, we wanted to select several words and maybe highlight them using CSS. So we need a way to be able to select several of those words, and this is where we can use spans. So we can use spans within our paragraphs. So if we wanted to create a span over here and highlight out this content, we can see that it stays in line, and even though we've added in that span element, we don't see anything really different in the output. So it's not outputting, it's not applying any additional formatting, it's just giving us a way to contain that content. And whereas divs, on the other hand, so if we had something where we've got this text here and we wanted to break that piece of text out, we see that with a div it starts a new line. So this is where I've added it in, where this word was here, and we see that it breaks out and starts a new line. So that's the big difference between spans and divs, and both combining them together gives you the ability to select out your text within your HTML and make use of it within CSS. And then this actually allows us really easy ability to add CSS. So for instance, if we wanted to change the background color of all of the spans that we have, we can see that all of this content is span content, and this gives us an easy ability with CSS in order to isolate out that content that we're looking to apply styling to. So the next lesson, we're going to look deeper into HTML and CSS, and I'm going to show you more about styling and how to really customize the way your content looks in the output, and that's with CSS. That's coming up in the next lesson. In the previous lesson, we saw how we can group elements together using divs and spans, and this gives us the ability to easily select those elements from our HTML page and apply styling to it. And what is styling and CSS? So CSS essentially gives you the ability to apply different styles such as colors, background colors, padding, borders, and a whole lot more to various elements in your HTML, making them look the way that you want them to look. So there's several different ways to apply styling to your HTML. So let's open up our editor, and I'm going to show you some different ways to apply styling. So we saw that when we added in our spans, we have the ability to add attributes within those spans. So for instance, if I wanted to change this one and I want to change the color to green, so color is gives us the ability to change the text color, the character color here. So this one changes to green, this one changes to red, and that one's red as well. So there is a downside to doing it this way, and the downside really is that we need to go back. So if we want to make some changes, we have to look through all of our HTML code. We have to find out which element we've applied this attribute to, and then we need to make updates on each and every individual one. So for instance, if now I wanted to change all three of these spans to all to be red or to be blue, then it makes it rather difficult. And this is where making selections of the elements and then also applying styling really comes into play. So let's open up our editor, and I've got essentially that same code copied down here. And now, for instance, if I want to apply styling to all of the spans, I have several different options to do that. So I can link to it within a style sheet. So this is a style.css file that's simply linked out to my index page. And the benefit of doing it this way is I can create index page, I can create about, contact, and link out to that same style sheet. And then if I want to change the span color or the paragraph color on every one of my web pages that are linked to this particular style sheet, I can do this really easily, super easily, just by updating that style.css file. And this will in turn actually update all of my content that is using that style sheet. And the other thing here is that we have the ability to update the styling within an internal styling by using the style tags, so opening and closing style tags, just would do with other HTML. And then within here, if I wanted to, I could make my selection and I can make an update. So I'm going to do color and do color purple and save that. And usually we just do this to the next line like this to clean it up a little bit and make it more readable, because the more readable your text is, the better. So now we've set the color purple. So let's go take a look and see what happens now. We see that that text actually changes to purple. So a number of different ways to bring styling into your web pages and make those selections on those various elements. And going back to CodePen, what CodePen is doing here is they're treating it as if this was an external CSS file that's just simply linking into your HTML document. So it's actually calling the CSS, calling the JavaScript within the head section of your page, and that gives it the ability to load that and to make it interactive here. So that was the same thing where we made that selection and we did divs, and I'm going to do background this time. There's actually background and background color, which I'll explain the differences in the upcoming lessons. So background color, and we'll just do green. We can see that right away it turns it green, and this is the same thing as linking out to that external file that we have within our editor here. So the next lesson, I'm going to show you more ways of actually selecting the various elements. We're going to look at classes and IDs and adding those to the elements to make it more, to give us more ability to select out and fine-tune what elements we want to apply styling to. So that's coming up in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be showing you how to use classes and IDs as attributes in your HTML elements in order to apply styling to various HTML code. So let's go take a look at our code that we had here within CodePen. So I'm going to get rid of some of this excess code and tidy it up a little bit. It's one of the beauties of working with CodePen is you can really clean that up quickly. So now we've got a bunch of content here. I'm going to get rid of the styling here. I want to get rid of this styling because, for instance, now we want to be able to apply styling across multiple elements. And we saw we can do that by selecting the tag name and applying styling to that tag name. So this usually doesn't turn out to be the best way to do that, because a lot of these elements you're going to be using multiple times, and you might not necessarily want the styling to be applied to it. And this is where IDs and classes come into play. So in order to apply IDs, so we'll first look at IDs, and this is just an attribute in HTML, and I can give it an ID of, let's call it highlight. and this gives us the ability to really isolate and identify this particular div. So all of the content that's contained within this element is now contained under the ID highlight, and we can use that ID within our CSS to actually make a selection of that particular element. And we know with IDs we can only use one ID per page, so we can only use it, so they have to be unique. So I can't do ID equals highlight, ID equals highlight, and I can't reuse it multiple times. So that's the reason when you'd be using IDs is when you only want to select a particular part of your web page. And in order to identify ID, we use the hash symbol in CSS, and then we use the name that's given to it, and then the format is the same thing where we do the curly brackets, and then within here is where we apply our styling. So if I want to make it red, I can make it red. And the really nice thing about this is that I've got all of my styling in one place, and I can really easily access it, update it, and see it. So if I've used really good naming convention, I should be able to identify this highlight within my CSS that this is where I want to highlight particular ID, and then I can update the CSS within there as well. And we can see that being output here within the display area. So I did say that IDs are unique within web pages, so you'd only have one ID per page. You can have multiple IDs across your website that are the same, but for the page itself, you need to keep it as unique. So this presents a problem if you've got multiple elements and you apply that styling to, and this is where classes come into play. So it looks the same way as you'd be applying ID, but we call it a class. And then the same thing here is where we would need to apply a class name. So I'm going to just call it class green, and now I can apply it across multiple elements, and then I can use my CSS to make access to that. And it doesn't always have to be that we're using spans and divs. We can apply the class to any element, so we can apply it to paragraphs. We can even apply it to input, so input type, and let's do a class there. So we see that we've got this input type. So let's actually do something with the class, and in order to identify classes within our CSS, we use the period, and then we use the name that we selected for that class. And because I've called it green, let's do a background color of green for this particular element. And we see that even within the input text field, our background goes to green. So important thing to remember when it comes to classes is that they can go across, just like IDs can go across and be applied to any element. And within this case, we've applied it to several different types of tags, and always getting that same result. We can see that we've got this seamless capability of making updates, and then if we all of a sudden decide that green should no longer be green but it should be blue, we can really easily do that within our CSS, where we can go into the CSS file and make that update to blue. So that essentially turns any one of these classes, and we can make updates to it and within our CSS file. So in the previous lessons, we've been looking at a lot about colors. So we've got color and background colors, and we saw that it actually changes the text color. We saw that background changes the background, and we've been using these predefined names for the colors. So there are a number of different ways that we can access our CSS colors. So we're going to take a look deeper into how we can set up and make selections of different colors and what our options are exactly for colors. So we've got these named colors, but sometimes you want to be more specific, and you might want to use a hex color or an RGB color. So that's coming up in the next lesson. This lesson is going to be all about colors in CSS. So previously we saw that we could set colors by using the named values of colors, so red, yellow, blue, and so on. And there's various different named values that we can associate within CSS. And there's quite a lot, and depending on the browser, some may or may not contain additional colors. So sometimes it's not the best route to go if you want to add in colors, and that's where typically you're going to see that RGB or hexadecimal colors get used, and this gives you the ability to really fine-tune the values that you want to use for your color. So for instance, instead of red, we can use a hexadecimal value, and hexadecimals are values between 00 and FF. So it's a count of hexadecimal, so we can start with, and it's 3 different paired values of those components, so bringing us all the way up to red, green, and blue. So for instance, if we wanted to create something that was all black, we would just do 000, and that would create a color that was all black. And maybe we can see it a little bit better here when we do the color, the background color all black. We see it within our output that everything goes all black. And so starting at 000000, now we can increment these colors. So the first one being red, so we can increment red. So let's say instead of 00, we had 99. We see that we've got kind of a more reddish color, and more red tint is being added into the color. And we can see that same thing for the background, so maybe a better example is within the background. So when I change those first 2 characters to 99, then we see that we've got this deeper red. And the lower the number I go, the closer to black it gets. And because this is hexadecimal, I don't have to stay with the numeric characters. I can go AA, so AA is increasing, BB is increasing, and I don't even have to combine them both the same. I can go BF, so this again is getting lighter. I can do CF, a little bit lighter, and we can see we can go all the way to FF, and this is pure red, and only red tint has been added to this background color. And we can do the same thing. So this one is going to be red. So I'm just going to comment that out. So comments within CSS is the asterisk and the slash. So I'm going to put that in that line, and we'll start again. So the next one that we wanted to look at is green. So green is that second slot of numbers, and I'll just start with 99 again. So see that it's going greener, and once we head over to maybe CC, it's even brighter green, and we go all the way to FF, and that's the most green we can get. Only green has been added to that color. And we can see we can do various combinations as well. So if we have a red-green color, that comes out to be yellow. So FF is yellow. And we can bring this one back down as well. And lastly, we do have blue that we can work with. And these are various combinations and tints. And as you can see, there's a whole lot of different values that can be applied here. So let me copy this one out, and I'll just mark that this one is green. And so lastly, we've got the 2 last characters there, and so this is for blue. So we'll start out with maybe 55. We see that the black is turning more of a deep purplish color. We can go to 99, even bluer, and we can go all the way to FF, which is pure blue, and we see that we're turning it the exact same color as the text value of blue is. So that's if you want blue in hexadecimal, and you can do various combinations of all of these colors as well. And as we saw, we created yellow. We can also do something where we've got 2 FFs there, and this creates this teal color. And if we do all FFs, then that's just plain white. So the opposite of 0000 is going to be FFFF. So that's the opposite of the spectrum and turning black to white. So there's also even more options that we can do when we're creating colors. So with colors, we can also use RGB, so that's red, green, blue. So the idea is relatively the same thing when we use RGB. So it's just in a different format. So we do RGB to specify that that's the color format that we're going to be using, and we specify how much red we want. So starting at 000, and it looks familiar, very familiar to what we just did with the hex, where 0 zeros are the starting point, and we can go all the way up to 255, and we see that RGB 25500, so this is red as well. And then the same thing, same idea for the green, go all the way up to 255, that gives us a green color. And then lastly, if I do this one all the way up to 255, then we get a blue color. And so there are also even more options with RGB. So there's what's called RGBA. So this is supported in most of the newer browsers. Some of the older browsers don't support RGBA. So sometimes you got to be hesitant if you're using it. If you've got a large portion of your traffic is coming from older browsers, then you might want to steer away from using RGBA. But if you are just looking to use standard browsers, newer browsers, you specify it by RGBA, and we see that we need one more value here, and this is the actual opacity. So opacity of, so these three characters are the same, RGB, so red, green, blue, and the last one, the A, stands for alpha. So alpha is how see-through that various element is. So we see that if we do a 0.5, it actually is adding in, it's creating a see-through color there, and we see that we're able to see the color that's underneath, which is white, so it becomes more dominant, and it makes the blue actually turn more clear. So, and if you had content underneath there, then this would be visible through this particular div. And we'll show you more about that and how we can move divs around in the upcoming lessons. But for now, it's important to understand that you do have this option of RGBA, and this gives you the ability to create alpha and see-through characters within your HTML code. So the next lesson, we're going to dive deeper into backgrounds, because we've been using background color, and earlier I also just used background, and there is actually a difference between background and background color, and I'm going to show you what that is in the upcoming lesson. So that's coming up. Let's look more into background and that background property in CSS. So we saw that earlier we had background and we were using background color. Now the difference between the two here is that background is actually a shorthand for all of the different background properties. So if we want to set background, and we also have an option to add in images into the background, so that's background image, and we need to specify with this, we need to specify a URL, so we just quote around there, and then we need to provide a path for that URL. And I'm going to use lorem pixel in order to grab an image here. So this will give us a background image. Go back over to here, paste that in, and we see that now we've got that background image showing up within our CSS, and it's linking to it. Now and that generally should be on the one line there. So now we see that we're going to just bring that same image into our editor. So it's in our brackets editor, and we've got background image there. And we've got still the color blue, and we see that we've got a brand new image there. It's taken up the background that we have available within our CSS. So a number of options as well that we can do with background image. We can set position of the background image. We can also have multiple background images if we want as well. So all we would have to do is comma separate them. So we could do the URL, we could do comma and have another URL there, and so on. So we can have multiple background images, and maybe the background image can be better seen when we apply it to body. So I'm going to just take that, remove that there, and apply it to body, and we can see that we've got that background image, and now I can comma separate it out, and I can have multiple background images, and in this case they're actually coming out the same because it's coming from that lorem pixel. But if you had multiple images, you could really customize the way that content gets displayed. So I'm going to just get rid of that second one there, and we'll just stick with one for now. And also we have some options here. So we see that by default it just repeats. So that image shows up once and it just continues to repeat. So we have some options here for to really customize what we want to do with background. And the first one that we can use is background repeat, and we can specify that we can have no repeat, so that only shows that background image once. We can also select out that if we want repeat, we can repeat it across. So by default it's repeat. We can repeat it across the x-axis, we can repeat it across the y-axis, and you can see this when we shrink down the size of the screen. So if I change it to y, we can see that it repeats on the y-axis. So we can really customize how we want that content to be positioned. So if we are repeating y, we can also update how we're positioning our background. So background, and this one is background position. So we've got an option, we can bottom, we can center, we can left, we can right. So if we do right, we see it pushes it over to the right. If we do center, we see that it centers that image, and this is because that image size is 400 by 200. So of course if we're working with larger images, or if we're working with even smaller images, we would see this effect even more. And again, that default is repeat, so if we just use repeat, that center really isn't going to do a whole lot. So we see that it does maybe something slightly, but there isn't a whole lot that center is actually really doing when we're using in conjunction with repeat. And even if we use repeat X, it's always going to repeat across that entire space that's available within our web page. And this, again, this is the body. So let's just go back to repeat Y and just show you what that looks like. So we do have an option within background in order to pull it all together, and we can specify all of these options here that we just looked at. One more thing that I do want to add in as well. So we do have the ability to set another option here, another property, and that's background position. And this gives us actually even more option here where we can do a background center, and let's update this to no repeat. So it's only going to show it that one time. So we can center it, and we can do background right if we want. And so we can center, we can push it right, and we can combine multiple different options here. We can do another one as well. We can do attachment. So instead of background position, let's do attachment. And what background attachment does is this gives us ability to set how that background gets treated. So if we do fixed, watch what happens with fixed. So as we scroll down, that background moves independently, or it looks like it just stays still. So depending on whatever the screen size is, that background is not going to be moving. We can see that it's fixed, centered, center position. We also can have several different options for attachments. So we can set, which is the default, we can do scroll. And what scroll does is that allows us to scroll the image. So now you see that that image is scrolling. Maybe I'll make it a little bit bigger. And let's do repeat, because we can see an even more effect when we do repeat. So instead of scroll, let's go back to fixed. And you'll see this used a lot in a number of different ways where you get that effect where that content moves independently of your page. So if you have a fixed image that you don't want to move around, you can just simply select it and keep it as fixed. So predominantly these are the most used options that we have when we're setting background images. And the really cool thing about background is, so we saw that we used background before, and that actually gave us the ability to combine all of this in one, where we can do background, and let's say for instance we still had a background color here. I'm going to just copy that one out and paste that in. So we've got all of these options, and instead of having all of these options, we can really shorten this, and we can do background, and let's just do a hex color. So turn the background blue. We're going to add in that URL, so we can do a background image. We can set it to no repeat, so that that background image is only sitting there in the fixed position, and we can do fixed. And notice that I'm just doing space in between there. So position center. And this one statement, this one line of code is going to do the exact same thing that all 5 of these lines did. And that's what the difference of background is. And if we do something where we leave out the rest of these properties within the background, we just use the one default, which is the blue one, and this is exactly what we were doing earlier when we're just using background instead of using background color. So the difference really is this is just a shorthand method of accomplishing a whole lot that you typically would do with multiple statements within your CSS. Next lesson, we're going to dive deeper into our CSS, and I'm going to show you how we can set widths of the various containers, and we can define them and apply even more properties, so we can apply some dimensions to them. And we saw that earlier when we tried to add the image into a fixed spacing of a particular element, that the image was just, it was too big and it didn't really look right. So this is going to give us the option to set and create brand new widths and heights for the various elements, and that way we can better position and add in things like background images. So that's coming up in the next lesson. This lesson, we're going to explore how we can apply different dimensions such as height and width to various elements within our HTML. So opening up our editors, we're going to use the class that we had set up earlier called green, and we're going to apply some dimensions to it. So there are a number of options for dimensions, and typically that's width and height. So we can set either a fixed width or a dynamic width. So let me show you what the difference is. So width, so we see that these particular elements already have a predefined width. We can see that this is it automatically, because this is a div, it takes up that entire width. So let's say we wanted to only use 100 pixels. We can see that right away that they resize, and it actually doesn't get affected within the spans, because these spans are automatically using the width that's already predefined within the div. So depending on the element that you've got those classes applied to, they might behave differently. So the best thing to do in order to provide width is to try to use it within elements that are already taking up a full width, such as the width that's predefined here within this div. There's also height, and we can set a height. So let's do 200 pixels as height, and we can see the default for height is whatever amount of space is being used depending on the height of the particular lines. And we see once we update that, especially for our input field, it becomes really, really big there. And the text, although still stays the same. Now there's a number of other options here that we can use, and some of these are more used within design. So if, for instance, we had a width of 500 pixels, which would be forcing it to be 500 pixels, and even if our page wasn't 500 pixels, some of our content would be going off the end. This is where we could use one called max width, and this will actually limit the amount of width that we're using here. So we see that when we're resizing, it will give us 100% if our size is less than 500 pixels, and once we go larger than 500 pixels, the max pixel width of this particular element is going to stay at 500. You can also do min width. So min width is going to be the opposite. You can do min height and max height as well. So the min width is going to be minimum 500, and as soon as we get bigger than 500, we see that it continues to expand. So it does become dynamic, and it's just the opposite of the max width, the min width, allowing us to set a minimum height for our container within our HTML. If we are building responsive, if we want the width to be always 100% of the page, doesn't matter how big the page is, this is where we can use that percentage. And we see here in our example that the widths are always staying at 100%. So it doesn't matter how big or small the page is, it's 100%. And we see that it overflow gets looped and it starts out as a new line, so we don't have any content hanging over outside of the visible area. And when we do 100%, we could also do 50%. So basically it uses the available width of the browser window and it makes that calculation and determines what size this is and how many pixels 50% of our viewable area is. And it makes all those calculations. And the same thing for height. You can do the same thing for height. So if I want it 10% of the page, or maybe I think we'll do 30. So we can do the same thing for height. You can see height is a little bit trickier because it's more relevant on what the container is. So depending on what container you're using, your height might vary depending again what your container is. So usually typically you could use either the percentage or the pix. Also EM, so these are scalable sizes. So we can do, so let's update this one. So 10 EM. So this is a scalable size, so depending what size of screen you have available, it will scale differently. So that's a width of a scalable size. And most of the time these types of units are used when we're referring to font sizes. We've also got PTs. So we've got PTs that are used in print units. You see, even though it does work within the browser, generally this is reserved for print units. So when you are using widths, try to stick with pix or those percentages, and that will give you a better output value that's more in line with the rest of the content. And then of course if you're using fonts, then you could use those EM size units. So the next lesson, we're going to look at how we can apply padding and margins and do even more with our selected elements. So that's coming up in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at borders. So we saw earlier that we were able to select the different elements. We could see them visibly when we do a background color. But let's say, for instance, you don't want to do a color because sometimes this does not look that great. Maybe you want to add in a border. So let's get rid of the background and we're going to use border. So border is simple and straightforward. We've got an option to create border, and we see we've got some different options here. So we can do border bottom, border color, we can do bottom style, width, and so on. So we've got a number of options here for what we can do with borders. So let's just do a border width, and for the width we're going to set a border of, and we're going to use pix, so we'll set a border of 2 pix, and we'll notice that we don't yet see anything. So this is actually coming from the brackets, those blue lines. Those aren't actual borders that are visible within the page content. So we need to have something else within these borders. So we've set a border width of 2, but we still don't see these borders. And in order to see the borders, we need to specify the border style. So when we specify border style, then this gives us what type of style, what type of border we want. So by default, we've got none, but we could do inset, inherent, hidden, groove, double, dotted, dashed, and most commonly you're going to find solid. And we see once we apply these, then we get these black borders around our elements that are selected. And I could go out to the actual page as well so that we can get a better idea without that blue selection there, that these are the borders. We've applied a 2-pick border around each one of the elements. One of the cool things about working with Chrome is you can open up the Chrome display screen here, and we can actually see HTML, how it looks responsively, and we can also, so I'm going to change where it's docked. So see, we've got it docked at the bottom. I'm going to move it over to the right hand side so we can see the content better. And within every one of these within Chrome, we're actually able to see all of that source code there just by hovering over it. If we want to see a source code of this, we could do inspect, and we see all of the source code that's available and that's creating that particular element. And when we go down here, so this is under the elements tag, but when we go down here under styles, we also see this box model. So we see margin, border, padding, and the actual width and height of that particular element. So we notice that it's 97.195 times 100, and it's got a border of 2. And by default, it's holding a margin of 16, and that's because this is being applied to a paragraph, and that's where we get these default properties that are sitting within our elements. So we can literally turn a div into a paragraph just by using those same properties. We've got that margin of 16. And we are going to look at margin in the upcoming lesson, but it's important to be able to identify that this is that particular border that we set. And the other neat thing about it is here we can actually edit it and we can see what it looks like. So I can add in additional content here. I can add in text shadow. I can add in color into it, so I can do that, and I can see the color of the border, so I can update those and so on. And then going back to here, we can see we've specified the color of that particular element and so on. So there's a lot of really neat things that we can do within our CSS. And also notice one other thing here. When I applied color, I changed the text color, but I also changed the border color because we haven't specified a color for the border. So let's go jump back out into our page here, and we'll do color, and I think it was purple there. So now our text is purple, our borders are purple, and let's set a border color. So we had options for border width and a whole bunch of different options here. We even have a border image. Let's keep our border black. So when I save that, now that we've got different border color and different color of the text contained within our borders as well. Update and try out some different styles. So we have a style, and we noticed as well that we do have that option where we can differentiate. So we can have a border color at the bottom, we can have a different color than we have at the top, and we just got to make sure we update those orders there so that we've got a border color of black, and then we're overriding that black color with a bottom color of aqua, and we can do the same thing for top, left, right, and so on. So a lot of options there. Even with border style, we can do dotted, so we can change it to a dotted style if we wanted to, and we see that right away it takes a dotted format. We could do solid, so dotted, solid. And we can also change, we can select from any one of those options there of the different styles. So brackets actually gives us a bunch of options here. So we've got dash, we've got double, groove, and it is kind of neat to look around and see all the different types of borders, but for the most part you're going to see people applying solid borders. Now you're also sometimes come into borders just being set with border, and this is similar to what we saw with the background, where we have a bunch of different properties we can be specific on, but we also have a shorthand method for writing borders, and we can do all that we just did up here within one statement, within one line. So we can do border, and we can set solid to pick black, and that's going to be the same thing. And then if we want to be really specific, we want to add that aqua color, then we can specify that after we set the default border. So essentially this one line of code does the same thing that these 3 lines of code did, and it just allows us to simplify writing all of that information out for our page. And we see when we refresh it, we've got all of that available to us, and we can customize it, we can take a closer look at it as needed within our HTML source. One other thing I did want to add, so this is still that input field, and you can see that I'm inputting text in there, and it's still taking those same properties that we set within our CSS with the border. And we know that by default input fields have borders, so if we were to set some to border 0, we would have our input field, but we would have no border visible within that input field. And this is something else to keep in mind when you're setting border sizes, and if you're applying it to those input fields, make sure that those input fields are visible, that you're applying some type of format that these input fields can be made visible. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at padding, and we're going to look at margins, and then the box model as a whole within CSS. So all of this is coming up. In this lesson, we're going to look at margins when it comes to CSS. So we saw that how borders worked within CSS, and we also have an option where we can do margin. And with margins, we have several different properties that we can set. We can set margin top, right, left, and bottom. So this covers all of the 4 different angles that a typical four-sided shape has, and this is a typical element within CSS. So let's set a margin top, and let's do 20 pixels. Or we saw that by default that paragraph had 16 pixels. So we can see that we can set a margin of top there, and maybe we'll do the margins for the highlighted elements instead of that green one there. And let's add a border on those ones now, so we can take a closer look at those. And we can see that now we've got a margin of 16 at the top. And again, remember that these various elements can behave differently, so depending on what we've selected within our source code. Maybe a better one to apply this would be to all of the divs. So we want all of our divs to have a margin at the top of 16 and a solid black border around them. And let's set it to 2 pixels, that's why we're not able to see it. So now we've got solid black border, 2 pixels around each and every div. So we can also, maybe we want to set a margin at the right. So margin right, and let's set it to auto. And we're going to do also margin left, and set that one to auto. So this is just a default automatic value that gets placed within there. So when I refresh it, we don't really see a whole lot changing. When I set a width for this particular element, so all the divs now are going to be 200 pixels. And we see that the interesting thing here is, well, if I've set a margin of right auto, a left auto, then it actually centers these particular elements. So if I get rid of one of these, we can see that it margins it over to the left or to the right. So it adds in that spacing and pulls them over to the right hand side. If I remove out the left, then it pulls it over to the left hand side when the margin auto is on right. So it automatically applies the margin, and if we want to center particular element, then we do margin right, margin left, and both at auto. So there is actually a short format for doing this within CSS, and just like we saw with borders and we saw with backgrounds, we can skip quite a bit of this these excess statements for margin, and we can simplify it by just using the margin statement. So I'm going to just comment this part out here, and we're going to just use margin. And the way that margin is going to work, so if we just use margin, the first value, if I set margin 10, then we see that every one of these elements gets a margin 10 all the way around. If I do an inspect here, and if I go to the box model, well, it's a little bit small, but I can make that bigger. We see that every one of these elements, so if I inspect it, I see that they're all containing a margin of 10. They all have a margin of border of 2. So it's doing the same thing as we saw with borders. When I'm not specific which side, either the top, bottom, right, or left, gets that particular value applied to it, it just applies to all of them. Same thing with border. That's why border is 2, because we haven't specified that we're setting a border on any particular side, and we just got that default. And the way that margin works is it uses, if there's only one value, it sets it across all of them. If we have 2 values, so I'm going to set a value of 5, and we'll see what happens now. So I'm going to save that and inspect that element. And we see that the margin top and bottom are 10, and left and right are both 5. And that's because the way that it works, it takes the top and bottom, if there's two values here, and then left and right as the second value. And if we want to be even more specific, we can set the bottom value. So this way we're setting the top to 10, the left and right to 5, and the bottom to 15. And then lastly, we can finalize this by setting the value of the left side to 25. So it basically does it clockwise: 10, 5, 15, 25, 10, 5, 15, 25. And that's essentially your options for margins. You have the ability to set all of the margins for all the sides. You have the ability to be specific what margin you want to set, and so on. And if you're ever looking to find out more about what CSS is available, using Chrome is a great tool to do this. We can see that we've got quite a lot of flexibility. We can see when we access it within Chrome, we can uncheck these, we can check them, we can get rid of borders. So we can really play around with our CSS and make it look a certain way right within the browser without having to update and edit our code. And we can see what each individual statement within our CSS does. So the next lesson, we're going to look at padding. Padding is going to be very similar to margins, and that's coming up in the next lesson. In the previous lesson, we looked at margins, we looked at borders, and we also looked at the dimensions earlier as well. And we see that within the typical box model, so we've got an example here of the box model within our browser, and we see we've got one last one that we need to take a look at before we complete the box model, and that's padding. So we don't have any values set for padding, and padding is going to be really straightforward. It works the same way as margins, but it sits on the inside of the border, whereas margins sit on the outside of the border. And that basically means that if you've got content, all of your content contained within this, if we add in padding, watch what happens. So we can do padding, and we'll do 10 pix padding. We see that when I save that and refresh it, we get this buffer between the inner content and that border. So we see that the padding is, so we've got our initial size width of 200 pix, we've got a padding of 10, and we've got a border of 2, and then a margin of 10. So the margin is outside of the border, border is the border, padding is inside the border, just outside of the content, and then the content sits within that actual confined dimension. So we've got 200 set there, and the content fills that area. So basically that means once we add padding, we add margins, borders, our actual size of this particular element is no longer 200, but we've got to take into account all the different other values here that we've set, and this would make the complete size of that container larger than 200. So the same thing that we saw with margins, we can set padding, and we can do padding bottom, padding left, padding top. And padding is going to work within that same format. So if I've got padding of 20, and then now we're setting a padding of 10, so that didn't quite work out well, but let's refresh that. We see we've got that padding of 20, so the padding is only sitting at the top of that particular element. And the same way, the same clockwise rotation of padding for shorthand. So if I want to keep top at 20, if I want it left and right at 10, I could do padding left and right 10. I'm just going to get rid of that one, refresh it, and we see now we've got padding of the top is 20, left and right is 10, and so on. So we can also set the bottom padding of 5, and then we'll do the same thing as we did earlier, and we'll set the left padding of 30. So we see that this gives us full control of how we want our output displayed, and all of this together, the margin, border, padding, and size, this is what's known as the box model in CSS. And it's really good to become familiar with the box model, because oftentimes users will confuse margin with padding. So we got to make sure that we have a good solid understanding about the order that these particular elements are presented in, and how they affect that content, and how it gets rendered out and output within our visible area of our display. So now that we've got a better understanding of how to position and work with the elements, we're going to dive back into HTML in the upcoming lesson and look at how we can add images and do some really cool things within our HTML. So that's coming up in the next lesson. At the very heart of navigation within the internet are hyperlinks. Hyperlinks give us the ability to move between different pages within websites as well as within the single website, and we're also able to move towards different sections within the website using hyperlinks. So let's take a look at hyperlinks within HTML, opening up our editor, and we're going to add in some hyperlinks. So for instance, if we had up here at the top, so I'm going to create another div here, container, and then within this div I'm going to have a hyperlink. So a hyperlink is just indicated with an A, so that's the anchor tag, and then within the anchor tag we need to specify where this particular link is going to go. So this is where we use href, and we need to specify the page that clicking that link is going to bring you to. And there's different ways to link out. So there's relative paths and absolute paths. So this over here, this index.html is a relative path. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy and I'm going to duplicate it to be about, and we'll call it about.html. So instead of, open up index again, and I got to copy that back in here. So notice that both of those pages are sharing that same style sheet. So first of all, let's link from index to about, and we're going to just use the relative path because it's relative to where the file is located. And when we click this, so we also need to have some type of output here for that hyperlink. So we see that, I'm going to close this for a second, and we see that we've got the hyperlink set up here, but we don't have anything there that we can click. So usually if we're doing navigation, we'd give it a name of the page that we're going to, and by default some styling gets applied to a hyperlink, so the browser turns it blue and underlines it, and we know that this now is a hyperlink. So if I click this, I go to the about page, and on the about page I'm going to cheat a little bit, copy and paste this in, and on the about page I want to link back to index because the content in both of these pages is the same. So let's refresh that. So we link back to the index, link back to the about, and notice here within the path here we're moving from index to about, so we're actually seeing different pages. And maybe also on the page itself I'll do a big H1 about, and I'll do one for the index as well. And then index page, so that we can really distinguish between the two different pages. So index page, about page, and we notice that we are able to move between them using hyperlinks. So this is the basis of how the internet ties all the different pages together, that giving us the ability to move to multiple pages. Now let's say we had a page and we wanted to hyperlink out, and in this case maybe we want to link out to Google. So what we could do is we could go to Google and we could copy that URL, and so this is going to be the entire URL. So it's going to be the absolute path, and notice the absolute paths include the HTTP, or in this case HTTPS, and it tells us the location of where this page is located. And I'm just going to add in Google there. Let's go back to our index example, and now we've got Google there as a hyperlink, and so I can click that and we open up to Google. The downside of this is that we actually, when we clicked it, we navigated the user away from our main content page, and this is definitely not something that you want to do, especially if you're linking out to external pages. So this is where we specify the target within the attribute of the hyperlink, and we can specify where the user is taken. So if we're linking out to an external page, we would use blank. So now if I refresh this and if I click Google, we see now Google now opens up in a new tab in the browser, so it's opening up in a blank page. We can also specify where we want it opening up, so we have the ability to open it up in a new tab. We can open it up in the parent, so if we have a framed page, we can open it up in the parent. So that's another option, and that will break out of the frames, but that will also overwrite the current page. And then by default, the default is self. So these ones here, where we're linking within our own page, the target is self, and we don't have to specify that because that's a default. And if we want to open it up to a new page, this is where we imply blank. So self opens up in its own page, target blank opens up in a brand new tab. And those are the most commonly used ones within CSS. We also have an option where we can link to bookmarks, so we can link to particular sections of our web page. So I'm going to take this one out, and I'm going to create a section down here. I'm going to give it H2 more information, and within here, I'm going to give it an ID. So I'm going to give it an ID of more info. And now I can use the hyperlink in the index page. I can link to a particular bookmarked part of my web page, and I could do that within that same format of the hyperlink. So instead of hrefing to a page, I can href to the ID of the section that I want to correspond to and that I want to target it to. We don't need to specify what the target. It's on our same page, and we just need to have some more identifying information, and now when I refresh this page, I've got more information, and I got to make it a little bit bigger for the effect. So when I click that, that didn't quite work. It tried to open up a new page, so we need to be more specific. And the same thing that we did with CSS, where we're specifying the IDs with the hash. Once we add that hash in, I'm going to just refresh it again, and once I add that hash in, then that gives us the ability to link to that particular ID on our page that's identified as more information, and it automatically brings the browser window down to that particular section. So this is what's called bookmarking within HTML, and this gives us that option in order to select and link down to that particular piece of content on our page. So in the next lesson, we're jumping back into CSS, and I'm going to show you how you can style hyperlinks, and you can actually style that same content that you do in your regular content as you do with hyperlinks. So this is coming up in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to look at styling hyperlinks, and we notice that with hyperlinks that they're not always the same state. So we saw that by default it was blue, but when I clicked it, then it kind of went this purplish color, and that's because there's different states to hyperlinks. So let's open up our CSS, and we'll take a closer look at what we can do with hyperlinks and how we can apply colors and styling to them. So hyperlinks, just like any other property element within our CSS, we can take the hyperlink tag, we can apply color to it, and instead of the blue color, we maybe want red to it. So when I refresh it, we see we've got a color of red. But now we actually don't see anything different here for the ones that was visited. We don't see anything different happening when we hover over it. So a lot of times you're going to see when you are interacting with content on the web page, it's more than just an underline. And so this can be accomplished as well by specifying the state of the hyperlink. So if I have if I want red, I can specify that I only want this red for a link. And basically that means for an unvisited link, it's going to be red. So when I refresh it, it goes back to that purplish color. And if I add in a brand new hyperlink, so let's do another href here. And I'm just going to link it to the style sheet and go back out and refresh it. So we see that by default, the unclicked link goes red when we specify the state. So we also have a number of different states. So we've got a visited state, And let's say if we want to go blue after it's been visited, so when I save it and refresh it, now these visited pages go blue. But I also want something to happen when I hover over it. So this is when the user is actually interacting with the link. So maybe I want the link to go green whenever a user hovers over it. So let's take a look and see how that comes into play. So now whenever I hover over any one of the links, we see that it's going green. I'll make this a little bit bigger there so we can see. So this is me just hovering over the links, they're going green. And we can also have one other one as well, so another state, and this one is active. And this one is actually pretty hard to see, but it takes place whenever the user clicks the link. So maybe I want to do yellow, and I also maybe want to do a background color so that we can really see. So now let's refresh it, do more information, and you can briefly see when I click on it, it goes red and the color goes yellow. But it's pretty hard to tell. You can kind of briefly see it for a second there before you get moved to the next page or the next part of the page. So these are your options when you're applying styling to the links. You have all these options to apply different styling. And the interesting thing, a part about it, is you can apply the styling to other elements as well. So it doesn't necessarily need to be an anchor. You can apply it to divs as well. And say for instance, so this is just specifying the tag, and all of these states are something that we can add in. So let's do hyperlink active, and obviously the visited won't affect that because we can't do a div visited because we don't have the attribute of the link that it's been visited, so we're not aware of all of them. The one that you might want to use is hover, because this is probably the only one that you can actually see what's happening when the user's taking an action. So whenever we hover over any one of our divs, let's just flip the background to be red, refresh it, and now whenever I hover over, whenever the user is interacting with our content, we see the color is changing. And we can do this, we can add in any number of values here within the CSS, so we don't necessarily need to even do background. We can do border, so maybe we want the border to go change yellow, or maybe we want it dotted or dashed. So any one of the options we can apply. So we see that now whenever we hover over it, it goes red, it goes the border goes yellow, and the border size increases. In the next lesson, we're going to be looking at images, and images are a great way to add some more tools into your web pages, and images are easy to add within HTML. So we're going to take a look at images and attributes associated with images, and even styling on images. So that's coming up in the next lesson. This lesson, we're going to be adding images into our HTML code. So with an image, it's an image tag, and we need to specify, much like we did with the hyperlink, where we need to specify a source of the image that we want to add in. And this is a crucial part of that image tag. We need that attribute, just like we need for the link. We need to know where that link is going. We need to know what image we're trying to use. So let's open up our browsers, and we're going to go to a website called Placehold.it. And this is a website where we can get placeholder images and use them within our code when we're developing websites. Lorem Pixel is the same thing. Lorem Pixel actually has real images, so it's visually more appealing, but I find usually with Lorem Pixel sometimes there's some lag when I'm developing, so that's why I usually like to just default to Placehold.it. Let's go open up our editors and add in some images within our HTML. So img, and then now we need to specify the source for the image, and I'm going to specify that path of the image and save that and refresh, and we can see there we've got our image being placed within our web page. And with Placehold.it, we can see that this is the default size of the image, so 350 by 150, and if we wanted a 550 by 150 image, we can get one of those as well, just by updating what the values are here that are being presented within that image source. Now with images, we also have, so if for instance this image was not available, so if we had something like that and we had forgotten that path, we see that we get this image icon popping up. So in order to prevent that from happening, we can just put an alt tag. And alt tags are super useful because if your image doesn't show up for whatever reason, then actually the user can actually see what was meant to be there. They're not left wondering what was meant to be there. And another thing that's really good about this is that we're giving screen readers the ability actually to see what the content is and what the content is supposed to be within this image path. So for whatever reason, if they're not able to see the image, then they can actually get some information about that image. So that's one of those essential tags, attributes that we add in with our image tags. And we've also got additional options where we can set a width and we can set a height. So if I want to set a width of that image, and we know that by default, placeholder it is using the property values of the path, but we can also specify that here. So notice when I set a width of 100, it keeps the dimensions, so it brings it down to 100, and it shrinks down the height as well. We can also specify the height. So we could do a height of 50. So if we didn't want it to shrink that down, we can specify the width and the height. Now this is directly within the attributes, and of course you can use styling as well. So if I took that one out, and let's open up our CSS, and we're just going to grab that image property, and we'll do a width of 300 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. We'll see what that looks like. So same thing, we can set the dimensions within the CSS as well, and usually this is a better way to go. It all depends on what type of code you're writing and how you're writing your code, but by default it's usually better to keep all of your styling in one place within the CSS file. And with images, just like with the hyperlinks, we can also do it to the relative path. So if I had an image located on my computer, I could do something like image.jpg. As long as that path was within that root directory, it would show up here. And if it wasn't within the root directory, I would have to be able to navigate to where that path is located. So the two dots bring it down one directory level, and the slash brings it up to one directory letter. So if I had a folder called image and I had my image placed in there, I could navigate to that path within this type of format as well. So let's go bring it back into that placeholder image, refresh the page, and also whenever you're hovering over it as well, you'll see that if you've got that alt, you can get that additional information about what's contained within that image. So in the next lesson, we're going to be looking at how we can present our content in a more uniform manner. So we saw that earlier when we had created all of these links. They don't really look that great. It's one link after another. They're all in line. And ideally, we would want to list out these links and make them more visible that this isn't the same link path. And especially if we got rid of the underline then within the CSS, then that would really look weird and it would just look like a regular paragraph. So we want to make a way where we can list out the links. And for this, we're going to be using the unordered lists and ordered lists within HTML. So that's coming up in the next lesson. In the next set of lessons, we're going to look at more content organization within our HTML. So we're going to look at unordered lists, ordered lists, also how we can specify what we want within those lists, how we want styles, options, and also description lists, how we can use these lists within a navigation bar, how we can use tables and do styling within tables. So all of this is coming up within this section. So first of all, let's open up our editors, and we're going to just work on the index page that we created earlier. And instead of having all of these elements here just lined like this, I want to create some structure for that. And for the structure, first of all, let's start with an unordered list. So that's UL. And every one of these items here within the unordered list, we can break them out and we specify them as list items. So that's LI. and that breaks them up. And when it's going to do the other two here, save that, go back out and refresh it, that we see that now that content gets presented in a nice orderly list, which is really good because now the users can see that this is not just one piece of content, there's different links and there's different things that are happening within this content. I can get rid of this first one here and refresh it again. So we see that we've got these 3 links here, and these are very evident that the user can do something with it. And when it comes to the styling, we typically wouldn't want to be applying all of the styling to all of the hyperlinks. So we might want to do something where we've got list item and refresh that. And so now we're only going to be applying this styling to the particular active links and the hover links as well. So just do that. So now we get that styling being applied to the hovered links. And this gives us more control over what we're doing with our links, so the list items. And we can also even just remove that out as well. And I'll get rid of that active one there and refresh it again. And we see that now we've got the color is changing whenever we're hovering over these list items. But notice that it's only changing this color, so it's not actually affecting the anchor text within there, and that's because we haven't specified that that's what we want to change. So let's refresh that again, and we want to make sure that the focus is actually going on that particular part of our code. And get rid of that hover that we had applied earlier, so to avoid the confusion. So now we're able to nest. So we've got a parent, so all the list items, and we've got a second level selection here where we're selecting all the anchor text. So if we've got a list item and we've got anchor text within it, then that styling is going to get applied to it. And that's how we can specify that we want to apply this to this particular piece of styling. So let's open up our HTML and let's look at some more options when it comes to list building. So we did say that we've got unordered lists, so these are just these bulleted lists, but we can also change this into ordered lists. So that's the OL tag. And go back out and refresh it, and we can see that with the ordered lists we can list out the various items that we have, and they get numerically sequentially listed. So 1, 2, 3, we've got 3 links. If we're building lists within lists, so if I, for instance, under the second item here, I had another list, I can nest a list within another list. So in this case, we're going to list an unordered list within there, and we'll just put in some default content. So again, list items, and this is just a list that's nested within another list, and so on. So you can see that it presents the content in a nice, neat, uniform fashion, and we can easily read this content as it's being output. We know that these are all separate items, and then these 2 items are contained within the second item here. We also have some options when it comes to ordered lists, so we can set a different type. So we can set, by default, it's a numeric type. We can use characters as well, so instead of 1, 2, 3 it'll be ABC. We can use lowercase characters as well, so ABC lowercase, and we also have an option for Roman numerals, so that's with the I, so 1, 2, 3 in Roman numerals, and we can also do this in uppercase, so that's an uppercase I, and we see that the output changes, the way that it gets listed changes. We can also specify a start number, so if we want to start that Roman numeral in position 5, we see that we can start Roman numerals 5. We can change it back to the letters, so it start at the 5th letter, so E, F, G, and continue and build out that information within the list. So a lot of options when it comes to creating lists and working with lists within HTML. And also there's another type of list as well, so there's description lists. So these are another way to create lists within your HTML. So let's go down here where we've got that more information, and I'm going to create a description list. Description lists are a list of terms within a description, so DL for description list. And then instead of list items, so we've got titles and then we've got the list items, so DD is for the item. And I'll just show you what this looks like and refresh. And I copy it, and I'm going to do 1, 2, 3. And I'll show you what that looks like. So when I refresh it and I go down there, it's looks like within that same format as the list items. It doesn't have any of the bullet points. These are really good if you've got multiple descriptive items here that you're listing. So if we're just doing it all items, then we might not necessarily want to choose to use a description list. But if we do have titles, so like much as what we did before, we can do first set or something like that, save that, refresh that, and we see that it indents those other items. So if we had a second set here, and there we go. So that's how we can do these descriptive lists, and we see that we've got these titles that are being that are more visible. And another neat thing is now if you go into your CSS, so you've got a differentiation between those list items. So if we do DT, and maybe we want to change the color or we want to change the background of those, we can really easily do that. So let's just do a quick background update, save that, refresh it, and we see that this is a great way to present your content really easily and be able to uniform it and stylize it with CSS and be able to differentiate the different items within that description list. So that's you create lists in HTML, and a lot of times lists are used for navigation and really to break apart content. So in the next lesson, we're going to dive into our list that we created earlier, and we're going to apply some styling to it. And we're going to transform this ordered list into a navigation bar. So that's going to be a really cool thing within CSS, and that's coming up in the next lesson. This lesson, we're going to take our ordered list that we created in the last lesson and update it and make it look like a navigation bar. So right now, it doesn't really look like a whole lot. It doesn't look like a typical navigation bar. So let's get rid of some of this excess CSS. And clean this up so we don't, we're going to be getting rid of the types there, so we're not going to be using bullet points. So we're going to change this to an ordered list. And we don't need this nested list within here either. So just cleaning all of this up, refreshing it. So we've got our 3 navigation items, and maybe we want to add another one here. So maybe this can go out to contact.html, and this one will be contact as well. And I don't need this target self because that's a default target. So clean everything up. I'm going to do a beautify there. And so now we've got 4 items here within our list. So let's say that these are our navigation items, and maybe we also want to include, so get rid of that one, and I'm going to change this to the index page. So this will just go back to the home page, which is index. So we've got 4 choices here within our navigation. And this is actually all we have to do with our CSS. So we just had to clean that up a little bit, and now we're ready, or this is all we had to do with our HTML, and now we're ready to go over to our CSS file. So same CSS file that's linked within our HTML document. So let's go over to that and take a look and see what updates we can make. We can actually get rid of this body part. We don't need that. And let's go down and specify that this is going to be navigation menu. So we'll give it a class, and we'll just call it navbar. And now we can access it and specify it using our HTML. So the first thing that we want to do is select our navbar class, and just as before, we want to be really specific, so we want to apply it to the unordered list. So we're going to just nest that unordered list in there, and let's update our list styles. So within CSS, you can specify the list style. So we've got the circle, decimal. We can even turn an unordered list into an ordered list if we do something where we've got our upper Roman. So just show you how that looks, and we're actually going to get rid of it altogether, but we see that we've got an unordered list, but it looks like an ordered list. So a lot of really cool options within CSS when it comes to working with any of the elements. So the first thing that we did, got rid of that list style, so got rid of those bullets there. So those are gone now, and we're doing all of this in CSS. And maybe let's set a width. So maybe we want to have a default width of that entire navigation bar. So maybe we could do something like 500 pixels. Or maybe we can just do 100%, so it goes all the way around. Next, let's set our margins for this. So we'll do margin, and we're going to set top and bottom to 0, and we're going to set right and left to auto. And yeah, this is why we probably better off to set a fixed width here. So refresh that. By default within here, so list items have some defaults, so we need to get rid of padding. So set padding to 0, and we see that when we set that padding to 0, we get this effect where it gets pulled over here to the left hand side. Also, let's create a background color. So typically with the navigation bar, you're going to have a background color, something that stands out. So maybe we'll do black, and we'll do text. We'll pull that out afterwards in the next statement there. So we've set that unordered list, and now let's select the list items in the unordered list. And the reason that we're selecting the list items is because this is important to understand that we want this entire element. So the list item element, we want all of this to have the properties specified within this CSS. And that's why we're specifying the list item. So we've got the unordered list, we've got a default width of it, we've got margins, we've got everything is set there. So we've got our default width, and we see that it gets centered as we get bigger. And now we can specify for each list item. So we've got 4 list items, so let's set a width for those, and we'll set a width of 100 pixels for each one. So we see that now they're starting to come out there. We're starting able to identify those list items. Sometimes you might have a different background color as well for those. So let's do background color, and let's do something like that. And we'll set a border. Solid red border. Of course, we can play with the colors later on. So maybe a better idea is to use a grayscale. And the background color is, and the border. So let's just refresh that and see what that looks like so far. There's also a display value in CSS, and this gives us the ability to display it so we can do an inline or an inline block. So there's a slight difference between inline and inline block. We see that when I switch it to inline block, it takes up that full block width. If I just do inline, it just takes up the required width for the cell. And because I want to set them each at 100 pixels, this is why inline block is much better. Also, let's update our line height. So line height is something else that we can specify within our CSS, and this will provide us some more spacing around the lines. So give us some more, essentially more space around each one of those elements. We can also maybe do a text align center. So all of the text, we want to take the same properties align. So I'm going to do a center up here. So we see that now it's starting to look more and more like a navigation bar. And now let's jump into the hyperlinks, and we'll specify the hyperlinks. So we've got navbar list item, and we want to specify any hyperlinks within the navbar, in that navbar class. So this is how we do that. So we're specifying those, and we see that we can't really see that text. So let's change the color of it, and we're just going to change it to white so it really pops and stands out. want to get rid of that underline there, so text decoration, we're just going to set it to none. By default, hyperlinks have a text decoration of underline. And so now we've got essentially what looks more and more like a navigation bar. And typically with navigation bars, we have that interaction. So if I've got the nav bar and once the user is hovering over it, they generally see a different color change or something happening. And this is where we're doing that anchor text there, or maybe we could do the list item, because we've got the background color set there. So let's update this background color and we'll make it go lighter. So refresh that, and now when we hover over it, we see we got the background colors changing. Maybe we even want to go even lighter than that. And also, let's update the color of the font. So I'm going to change it to black whenever we hover over it. And I'm just going to clean that up. And essentially, this is how you can transform your ordered list into a navigation bar. Now let's go back out into here, refresh it, and we can see that we've got all of these properties taking place. This one thing we're not changing the color, and that's because we have the color specified there. So if I remove that, and I can use now the color of that entire page. So we need to inherently as well. So notice that it's applying the colors of that last element value that we're specifying. So that's why when we had it within our anchor text, we were specifying that those were the colors that we were using, but now we've specified it outside of that. And we can add something like that, and we can specify the color of that one, and we'll just change it to black. Because right now what's happening is it's not taking all of those hyperlink states that we had earlier. So that's why I had to break that out and take that out of that list item, because this list item doesn't have all the same states as the hyperlinks did. So thus I removed it out of the list item property, and I created a brand new one to hover over. So this gives us the ability to create a quick navigation bar, and of course we can update and play around with the colors as needed. So in the next lesson, we're going to jump back into our HTML and look at tables. So this is another way that we can present content within our HTML structure. So it's tables coming up in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at everything about tables within HTML. Now, tables are really simple and straightforward to set up. So we use the table tag, and we do an open, and we do a close. And then much like what we did with the list items, we need to specify how that table gets structured. And with tables, the default is TR, so that's table row, and all the cells within the table are contained within rows. So let's close off that row, so TR. So we do have an option that we might have multiple rows within a table, and a table can contain multiple cells. So to create a cell within a table, it's TD. So maybe we're going to do a chart of people's names, so TD. And maybe we've got some more information that we want to hold, so another TD, and we want to maybe do an age, and also we want to do maybe a location. So there we've got a typical table, and you might have more than just that one. So typically for a table, you've got tons of information. So you've got maybe a bunch of people here, and they might be located in several different locations within the containing different data. So I'm going to add in one more here, and then we'll show you how we can style it and really make it kind of come to life there. So we've got another person here, we've got a name, and then a location for this person. So now we've got a very basic table. We've got some data here, we've got some cells, and so on. So with tables, we also have some more options. So we can add in headers within the tables. So much like we did with ordered lists and the descriptive lists, we can add in a header here. And instead of using TD for the cells, we're going to do TH. So this is going to be for table header. And close that off. And then next we're going to do another TH, and this one will be for age, and close that one off. And one last one for location. So there, that gives us some more information. Maybe we'll just get rid of that first and just do name. So this gives us some basic information about how our table looks. So now we're ready to apply some styling to our table. So that's our basic table. We've got names, ages, locations, but you know, it could look a little bit better. So let's add some styling to it. So first of all, within the table, we might want to add in some borders. So let's do a one pick solid, and we'll do a light border. We'll do a fairly light border. So we'll do kind of a grayed out border. And let's do border here. So let's see what this looks like. So now we see we've got the table, it's got a border, it's ready to go. If we want to add in borders for the other elements, we can do for the table cells, we can do the same thing, or we can combine them within our CSS. So if I wanted to apply a table border for those ones as well, I can really easily add it within this type of format. So now we can see that we've got more table information. I could do a width for the table, so let's just do max width, or maybe for this table we want to do a min width. So our minimum width for this table is maybe 300 pixels. So we see that it nicely spaces that out. We might want to also do for each one of the cells. So the TDs, we want to do width of, so if we wanted them all the same width, we can do 33%. And of course we can play around with how this gets presented. Maybe for the age one, we don't want it to have it 33, we want to be more specific. So we can make those adjustments by making our selection within our CSS. Maybe also for the TH, for the table headers. So we might want to do a background color so it really stands out. So background color, and we'll do a font of white. Now also there's some other additional options within tables. So what happens if I've got one cell that maybe I want to go all the way across on the cell? So this is also something you can do, and you can add this within the CSS. So table row, so we're going to create a brand new row, and this row is only going to have one value. So maybe we have something like total people or something like that, and we see that the cell only takes up that one space, but we want it to go all the way across, and this is where we can specify things like call span, and this will give us the ability to span across 3 columns. So call span 3, we can span across 2 if we want, and that will cut us off roughly around there, or by default it's just the 1 span. So we're going to do 3 so we can span all the way across. And this gives us even more flexibility with how we're presenting our content. Just like we did call span, we can do row span. So let's add in another row here. And we're just going to keep this blank. And then instead of, so do TR, and I'll do another cell here. So maybe this one could be another heading there. So TH and TH and end it with TR. So it's closing off that table row, and what's happened here is it's offset everything, it doesn't look right, and this is where we can use row span. And the same way that call span, we can do row span across 4 rows. And we see that now that gives us the ability to kind of move that over. And maybe this should be, instead of TD, maybe this should be TH. So that way we're crunching everything over, and notice that now I can adjust that call span to 4, because now we've got 4 columns here. And instead of 33%, because it's trying to squish itself into 30, so we'll just update this to 25. So again, we have a nice even table, and of course we can work more with that as needed. We can update the border colors, so we've got that border color there. So maybe we want to update some of this, we want to merge these together. Maybe we want that whole row span there starting right up at the top. Again, these are options depending on how you want to present your table data. You can really fine-tune how your table gets output just by applying styling and working with the structure of the table within your HTML. It does take some time to play around with it and get used to it, but once you've got the basics down, how to build out your tables, you can pretty much make your table and present your data in any way that you want using tables in HTML. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at HTML forms, how to build forms using HTML, and in addition, how we can do some styling to those forms. So first of all, let's open up our editor, and we're going to create another page. So I'm going to use that about page, and I'm just going to copy it and save it as contact.html. So that's going to give us our third page there, and instead of about, let's update this to say contact. And let's open this one up here. So we've got our preview here on the right hand side of what this page is going to look like. I can get rid of, so I'm going to add that navigation in after when we do some fine tuning of our web page. But for now, let's just get rid of some of this content because we don't need all of this excess content. And I can even minimize what our styling is because it's pretty much going to be just HTML. And we'll even get rid of that as well. So let's start out by creating a basic form. So forms are used for communicating information from web users to our backend and sending data between users and web pages. So sending information, picking up information, and so on. So basic form within, essentially we're just using it to collect content from web users. So let's start by creating our basic form. And just like with any other tag in HTML, so opening and closing tags, and then everything in between here, this is where we've got our form elements. So the most common one that you're going to use within HTML is an input. So an input element, this one is going to be specifying a type, and we've got a number of different types that we can use within HTML. So for this one, let's just do something really simple and straightforward, and we're going to specify this as a text type. So we're going to be expecting a text input here for this input. And another important attribute is the name, because this gives us the ability to actually identify which input field this particular piece of data came from. So let's just do first name as a name of our input field and close that off, and now we see that we've got this input field created. When I refresh it, I've just got the simple input field there, and we can also add in a button and a number of different ways to do buttons, but for now I'm going to show you how to do an input, and we're going to do input type, and the type is going to be a submit button. So type, so input type, and we see we've got a number of different options here for different types. There's quite a lot actually now with HTML5, but we're going to use the submit button. We don't have to actually give it a name, but we do need to specify a value. And we can do the same thing over here with the value for that input field, where we can get a default value showing up. So this value within the submit button is actually going to be what's visible. So enter and close that off. And now we see we've got the makings of a very simple form. Because we put a value in the input field, it predefines that value, and then this of course is editable. And then we've got our submit button, and when we submit it, we see we've got this posted URL here, at the top, it's submitting it to itself, and we've got first name and whatever value we've entered in there. Now when I press it again, I've got first name and the value contained within the input field. And the idea with input fields is that we pick this up on the server end and then we do something with that data that the user has input and submitted into our form field. So this is just a typical, really easy, straightforward form, and we've just got that URL information. We can also specify, so by default we see it's going to the contact page, but we can also be more specific and we can specify the action. So this is going to be the page that it's actually submitting to. So index, so I'm going to submit it over to the index page. So when I refresh and now I submit it, we see that the path over here has now changed to the index page. So we're able to specify where we're submitting it. I'm going to remove that for now because I just want to be sending it to itself, or maybe I can just put contact in there. So this is the endpoint that you want that data to be passed to. And as mentioned, there's quite a lot of options for inputs. So take a look at some additional input types. So there's input type, and brackets gives us a whole bunch of options here. So we can do things like a checkbox. And basically a checkbox creates a checkbox there. We can also do input type. We've got color, so this is a new one for HTML5. So when I click that, we see we've got colors broken out there. So that's really neat within HTML5. I can also, I'm going to jump into going into the CSS. I'm going to do a quick fix here so that we can actually have these inputs on different lines. So I'm going to do input, and I'm going to do display and block. And we see that when I enter in that CSS, now these inputs are on different lines. So it saves me a little bit of trouble, and it's usually not the best way to go, but just for demonstration purposes so it's more readable, the different input types. So more input types. So we've got input type, and we've got date, which is another really cool, useful one within CSS. When I refresh it, I can open up the calendar, I can specify a date. So that makes that input really easy. And always remember to include the names. I'm not doing it just because we're demonstrating here, but always try to include the names. There's email, and this is an interesting one because when I set up email, we don't actually see anything different as we did with color and date, but if I try to just type some text, we get this little pop-up message when I try to submit it, and it says that it checks to see if it's a valid email and gives us a little message there and won't allow us to submit until it is. So that's one of the cool benefits of doing email as the type. We've also got file type. So this is if we want to upload content from our web browser, we choose the file and then it gives us information about the file that was selected. So if we wanted to upload files and content to our browser, so we've got file, we've got hidden. So what hidden does is, when I refresh it, and I'm just going to create a name for it. I call it hide me. You see that hidden, if so I'm going to put a value there. So when I submit it, we do have a value there for hide me equals test, but we don't see it within the output. This field can be used if we're actually presenting content that we don't want the user to be able to see, but we can add it into our form kind of in the background there. So this is different than if we do input type password. So password, sometimes those get mistaken, but password is actually different because we get a password field, so we can't actually see what the characters are. We just get a series of dots there. And I know there's quite a lot here that we're showing you. And again, it's when you're building out your form fields, you just got to make sure you're selecting the proper ones that you want to utilize. Another one that's used quite a bit is number. So what number does is it won't allow me to enter characters, just numeric values, and it gives me this chevron here to move up and down to increase the numbers and decrease them. So another one, input type equals, and there's URLs. So this one is going to work the same way as the email address. So when I type in something here, if it's not a real URL, it gives me an error message. So same type of idea as the emails, where the browser is actually smart enough to know that what type of content it's expecting, and also telephone number, submit, search. So these are fairly similar. So reset value, and I'm just going to give it a value of reset. And the reason I have to give it a value because it creates a button, just like the submit button. So reset actually is just a quick way to clear out the fields within your form. And as you can see, there's, depending on what you're using and what you're trying to accomplish, there's a different type that's more relevant to what you're trying to do. There's also radio buttons, so input type. And similar to checkbox, there's radio. And the thing with radio, always make sure that you've got the name, because it ties them together via the name. So when I say it ties them together, so if I've got one radio button, sometimes you'll have more than one radio button, and if the name is the same, that gives you the ability to toggle between them. And oftentimes you've got multiple radio buttons. So if you only want one value being selected, this gives the users the ability to kind of toggle between all the radio buttons. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at even more input formats for HTML forms. We're going to look at select, text area, and then we're going to look at how we can structure this and present it in a little bit better fashion. So all of that is coming up in the next set of lessons. Previously, we had looked at some of the options that are available to us when it comes to forms. So we're going to dive deeper into what our options are, and we see that we've got some more ways of creating different elements within our HTML forms. So we're going to look at select. So again, it's always important to include the name. So no, I didn't include it in most of these ones here. That was just to save time, but you do need a name in order to pick that up on the other end. So let's create select. Select is just done like this, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of an ordered list where you've got the main parent container, and then you've got all of your options that you have to list out here. And within these options, this is going to be the visible option to the user. And let's open up our browser. So now we've got this list here, and actually probably they should say something different. So now we've got 1, 2, 3, and let's add in a name in here. So just call it SEL. So refresh that, make a selection, and enter. And notice that we are selecting the value 2. So in some cases, you might not want to present the user with the same value that's visible. And for those types of scenarios, you can add in values. So instead of character 1, we can update these to value 1, value 2, and value 3. And now watch what happens within that string there. So when I refresh it, I'm going to select 3, and notice that before we were doing SEL2. When I enter it, now we've got SEL3. So it's actually taking the value that's been specified within the attribute of the option. So this gives us more flexibility when we're presenting different types of content. Another commonly used input format is text area. With text area, we do specify within the attributes the rows and columns. So if I've got 5 rows and I've got columns, so maybe I want to do 30 columns, this will give us an idea of how big the text area we want. And notice the text area is fairly large here, and by default you can always drag and resize them. And if I specify different different columns or different rows, it will automatically set that up. We can also style it within our CSS in order to present it at different widths and heights and so on. Another thing that we can do within text area, so you're probably wondering, well, we saw over here if we have an input type here, any of these inputs, we can set values to them, and we can see those values get added in as a default. So for text area, if we have a default value, it's just going to go between the opening and closing text tags, and that's where the default value is going to sit. So whatever we add in, it continues to add in additional information into those values. So that's how text areas, and this is these are the most commonly used types of inputs for forms. And now next lesson we're going to look at a better way of grouping them. In the previous lesson we showed you how we can create some quick CSS and style it a little bit better, but there are some default HTML elements that we can use to do the styling, so I'll show you how to do that in the upcoming lesson. This lesson we're going to be looking at how we can group form content together using labels and field set. So let's open up our editor and we're going to look at the form that we created earlier. So this is on our contact page, and what we're going to do now is we're going to make some updates to this. So I'm going to just update this to name. I'm going to remove out that default value that we set so it actually looks more like a contact form. Maybe we can keep that selection that we've got a number of different options. So maybe this can be for a different department. Select department. And we've got various departments within our business that they can contact. So we'll give them a choice in the drop down to either contact our shipping, our sales, and our marketing. So we've got 3 different options here in the drop down for users to add in content. We're going to give them a text area, and we also want to keep email, so we want to have an email address so we can respond back to them. So we give this one a name and just give it a name of email. Keep things really simple. So we've got text for the name, first name. We're going to do an email address. We're going to do a drop down of a department, and the rest of this stuff here we don't actually need here. So we're going to get rid of all of that, and we're just going to keep that submit button, and instead of enter, contact us. So let's take a look and see what our form looks like now. And we see that we've got this form set up, but it's not really evident what type of information we're expecting here within the form. And this is where we can update the form, and we can use different grouping methods in order to better outline the content that we're expecting within our form output there. Field set is one of the tags that's often used in order to break apart some of the content, so that's just field set. And we're going to open and close field set, and pretty much most of this is going to be sitting within that same field set. So it's pretty much that entire form is within the field set, so opening and closing. And we see that we got now a little bit more structure there, and we've got some content wrapped around there. We also want to have labels. So labels are just label. And within the label attributes, we need to specify what we want to label. So this is where we use for, and for is to specify which field it's for. So this is for the field with the name name. And within the label value, specify that we're asking for a name, so we'll do your name. Save that, and now we see that we've got this nicely, neatly placed field there, and we're going to do the same thing for email, so we'll do your email and specify that this is now for email. So the field named email, that's what it's for. Also need to add in the IDs in this case as well, because we are applying the labels. So let's do ID for name and ID for email. And next, let's do another label over here. And this label is going to be for, so it's going to do the same naming convention where I've got names and IDs are going to be the same, because setting IDs gives us the ability to pick those up within our HTML code, within CSS, and so on. So it's always a good idea to include those IDs as well. And then lastly, let's put a label here, and we're going to call it for our message. And then let's add in that message information. And I'm going to get rid of these. We're going to use styling instead. So let's do name equals message and ID equals message. So that way we tie everything nice and neatly together. And let's type in message in here. And here we need to do which department, so that the user knows that we're expecting them to select a department there. So I'm going to refresh it, and I'm going to actually get rid of this input display block, so that now we've got our default form, but it doesn't really look nice and neatly. It's not presented nice and neatly, so we need to add in some additional structuring into our form in order to present it in a more meaningful fashion. Let's add in some styling here, and for the form itself we're going to do ID, and so this is going to be our contact form, and this is how we can identify that we want to access content within this one particular form. Now we have a few options. We can use field set as well. So if we wanted to, we could break apart some of this content here in the field set. That creates some differentiation between the different areas. We see that if we had the first name and the last name, we could break it apart a little bit more like that. We can also do things where if we want to, we could add in a div here, and then this div would contain that, and then this div would contain the content of this particular field set. So we could save it. I'm just going to clean that up quickly. And we can see that we are starting to get a little bit more structure. Although usually with the field set, I usually prefer to just keep it for the entire form. So just, I'm going to move that one back to the entire form. I just want to show that there are various options here. And we can see that with the divs, we're getting the new lines. So we could just as easily just do them all as divs. We can do a div here as well, close off the div after the user makes the selection, and the same thing for the text area. So we could really easily use divs in order to break apart our content and make it more presentable. So this is one of the options that we have. We can also use I'm just going to add in another div for the submit, and this will make it easier within the CSS when we try to break apart this content, because now we can identify all the divs and select the divs only from our contact form, because we gave the contact form a name. So we can select the contact form in our CSS, and we can apply some styling to that now. So if we wanted to apply styling to the contact form, we can set a background for it. So a lot of times you'll see maybe a different background color for the contact form. And you might also have a border for the contact form. And then this could be whatever color really just makes sense. So there we could differentiate our contact form from the rest of our content. We can also break apart the divs within there, so we can specify contact, and we can select only the divs, and we can put some padding around the divs. So do 0 and 10 pixels. You can see that now it's moved it in a little bit. We might want to have within the contact form itself some padding around there, so we might want to do maybe 10 pixels for all the way around within the contact form. We might also want to add in margins, so maybe each div would have a margin top, and do 5 pixels of margin. So that gives us some more spacing between the different divs. The message one we might want to have start on a new line, so we can do that in a number of different ways. So let's go down here and we'll just do a line break there for the message. And for the message text area, let's specify some sizing for that. So let's do width 100%, height, and this is where we can get really specific, so maybe 100 pixels. So essentially this is how we can build out our contact form. We can also be very specific when we're selecting our inputs. So we can do contact and we can do input, and we can be specific on the type of the input. And that's what the really neat thing about CSS is, that we can really without actually having to do a lot of update to our HTML, we can do updates on it. So if I want to update only the text type, and maybe I want to update also the email type, I can comma separate them out, and this way I can apply styling just to these two different types. And so let's say for instance I want to create the width to 100%. So that way it goes all the way across, and for the shipping department we don't want necessarily to create it all the way across, so maybe this is good, or maybe we want to keep the same format and place it underneath. So a number of different options there. If we can also select out that submit button, so if the type is submit, we can go all the way across and we can add some additional styling to it. So we can do a border, and we'll make this one fairly dark color. So that gives us our contact area right away, all the way across. Let's do a height on that one as well. So it's definitely worth taking the time to play around and see what you can make happen, create a bunch of different contact forms and so on within the HTML and CSS. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up in CodePen, and we'll just create a brand new pen for this, so a new pen, and I'm going to copy and paste that code into it. So that gives us the ability to kind of play around with it and build upon what we've done in the previous lesson where we were building that CSS. So they're going to just grab that CSS that we applied to the contact area and only to the contact area. So we don't need that navigation bar because that's just for the rest of our web page. Apply that CSS, and there we've got our contact form. And now we can really play around with it and update some of the styling. So if, for instance, that particular color wasn't working, we could update the color to be a darker color. Maybe we want to change the color of the font to be a lighter color. So a lot of options here, and we can really begin to customize out how our contact form gets presented within our CSS. Next set of lessons, we're going to look at HTML5 and the structure that HTML5 allows us to create within our web pages, also iframes, and how we can add JavaScript into our page. Up our editor, and we're going to go over to the index page. And I'm going to just create no split there, and we'll just look at our index page. So our index page right now, we've set up a navigation bar, we've got some content area here, and it's hard to really tell how the page is actually broken down. And this is where the new semantic elements in HTML5 really help us out. Now previously we were always using a lot of divs. We used divs here for the navbar, and divs were used over and over again to create that structure, so we would just give it a class or an ID in order to differentiate the different divs. So now when we're using HTML5, we've got the option to use more semantic elements within, and they all behave the way that divs behave, but it gives us the option to create these semantic elements. So we have one called header, which is a typical one that we keep at the top. And this would be where you place all of the contents of your main head information. So if I had this index page here in the header, this is where I could place that. So typically this might be an introduction, a company name, company logo, some images, and so on. So next section within our web page is the navbar. And the way that I want to break this up is I want to use the new semantic elements, and that's nav. So you see that when I change it from div to nav, we don't see really any difference in the way the content's being presented, but we do see that it's being a lot more readable when we look at our HTML code. And that's the whole idea between creating these semantic headers, navs, and next we're going to look at the content section. So content section is a little bit less intuitive because depending on the website, there's usually a lot of different options and people present content in a number of different ways. So the way that I wanted to do it within this lesson is I want to have essentially a two-page website. So I want to have essentially two different areas of content and then put a footer at the bottom. So I want to have a smaller area and then a main content area. For this one, I'm going to use a div, and I'm going to create a div, and then I'm going to have two separate areas within the div that have the contents. So this will be the first. So all of this content will be contained within the div. And this first piece of content, I'm just going to use section. Sometimes you're going to also see that article gets used. So again, depending on how you're designing and what your aims are, you can use different elements in order to break apart the content. And then for the other side, so I've got kind of a little side menu that I wanted to create. So for this one, I'm going to use a side. So these are just, they all behave the same way as divs. It just makes it more readable and our content is easier to follow when we look at the source code where the meaning is and how we're presenting that content. So when I go out here, we don't really see a whole lot of difference here. And all the difference is really going to come when I apply the styling. And then lastly, I want to add in a footer as well. And so this can have some company copyright info and so on. So that will give us another section within our code structure in order to present that particular information. So now that we've got this all set up, we need to start applying some styling to it. And the styling is going to give us the ability to really fine-tune the way that this content gets output. So right now, all we've done really with the semantic elements is broken down the different sections. Allowed us to create some page structure. So another thing that we want to do as well, whenever we're linking and we're creating our template, we might want to include JavaScript. In the same way that we've got an external CSS file, we would also include an external JavaScript file. And this is just done with script. And then we do the source for the script. And in this case, I've got a file called JS. So it's a JavaScript file. And this way, we can bring that JavaScript file and all its capabilities directly within our template. And the important thing is that we should always include all of the files, external files that we're linking to, because as we're designing the website, we're going to have to copy and paste some of this stuff over into the other web pages. So this is going to make it more difficult when we have to customize some of the website content. And there's actually a trick to doing this, and I'm going to show you that in the upcoming lesson, how we can actually use frames and iframes in order to structure our web page, and that way we only have to update one part of the website with all of this new code. So if we've got navigation menu and all of this stuff is going to be the same across most of the pages, then we can just use frames. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to apply a frame, and instead of this div and all this content, we're going to move this all into framed pages and then call those different framed pages on the different websites. So all of that is coming up in the next set of lessons. In this lesson, we're going to look at iframes and how we can use iframes within our websites in order to bring in external page content. So that just basically means that we can use content that's actually not sitting on the page directly. So if I was to take something like the navbar, and if I was to create a brand new page and save that, and now I'm going to save this as nav.html. and then I'm going to go back to my index page. And then now what I want to do, we see that that page is actually gone, and I want to bring it back into my web page. So I can use an iframe in order to do this, and I can link to that page. We can even give the frames a name, so nav frame, so we can identify it. And we see that once we bring that back in, we see that we've got access to the navigation frame. Now there's a big downside to doing this, and that's because the CSS now no longer has access to those elements, and we have to either redo our make some updates to our CSS, or we have to accommodate this in another format. So in this case, we already have a style sheet, so we can call out to the CSS and we can select the frame just as we do. So we need to give it an ID actually. So I'm gonna quickly jump back and give it an ID, so that this gives us the ability to make access to that frame. And it does make things a little bit more difficult, so always be cautious when you are using frames for your website. Sometimes it's worth the extra effort, sometimes it's not worth the extra effort in order to structure and to build out all of this. Depends really how many pages you're going to be using within your website. So you can see that now I can select that, and I can actually access some of the elements in there. So I know I have a navbar that's contained within there. Do this in a number of ways, and remember that now this is a completely different page, so that's why it's not linking that anymore. So I'm going to do border 0, so I'm going to do border width to get rid of the border around the frame, so it brings it more into the page. So we have a choice where we can go back over here, and instead of, we can simply apply its own CSS to there. So we see that we get that CSS being applied, but not really ideal. Things aren't really looking exactly the way that we want it. So again, we've got to always keep in mind that with these frames, it's not always the most ideal scenario. So this one, we know that we've got a width of 500, so I can do the same thing for this. I can apply a width of 500, and I can do a height, or I probably need more than that, so just do 50, or it looks like I need even more than that. Let's do 80. And again, it makes things more difficult, and it always depends on if you're trying to what you're trying to do with the frame. So let's change this to 600, and I'm going to introduce overflow. So overflow, we can hide any content that's overflowing the frame, so that will remove out anything that's hanging outside of the frame, and it makes the frame look more that it's available within the web page itself. And notice that now these attributes are going to move along with the frame size. So we see when I change it to 100%, we've got that 100% width there. I can get rid of the background color now because we can see where the frame is sitting. And this is an easy way where I can bring these frames in. But the other problem here is that when I click it, I've got to change where the navigation is as well. So I've got to change the target. So the target for this case would be parent. And again, target parent. And target parent. So if I was using the same navigation across multiple pages, this would be my way to maneuver through there and be able to move to the different pages. And this way, the real benefit of this is if I'm changing my navigation bar, so all of a sudden instead of home, I want to call this index, or I want to add in a new item here within my navigation bar, it can propagate across all the different pages. So I only have to build out this navigation bar once, and now I can go over to my contact form, so I can add in my navigation bar just with the iframe. And I can go to the About Me section. I can add in the navigation bar there as well. And we can see that now I can actually maneuver through my pages. I've got my navigation bar, and it's updating as I'm updating it within my web page. So again, dependent on how you're designing your content, you may or may not want to implement this. It does add an added bit of complexity, especially when trying to connect to the various elements that are contained within the nav HTML file. And also if you've got this nav file and you've got multiple folder structure and it's more complex, your website, you might want to still opt in for that, but you might want to structure it a little bit better within what you need to actually use the iframe for. So if you're not changing your content, stick with the regular on-page content, copy and paste it into the contact and about me. It's for this case, because I've only got the 3 pages, this is more than likely what I would do if I was building out this page, but just to illustrate, we can show you how we can use those iframes to provide more efficiency in our website development. So the next lesson, we're going to look at how we can apply some styling to these different sections to really differentiate these sections and make this look more like a web page that we're intending to build. So that's all coming up in the next lesson. We're going to focus and dive deep into styling of our web page structure. This lesson is going to be all about transforming our basic HTML page into an actual web page and having multiple columns within our web page structure, including a header, footer, navigation bar. So the last lesson we showed you how we can have a framed navigation bar. So let's continue to build this out. So I've got my index page here and I've got my display area here on the right hand side. So let's go ahead and build out the rest of the content on this page. So each page will have a different set of content, but we are going to keep that same or similar structure. And one of the benefits of not framing it is that you can change the structure. So for the contact form, we probably don't need to have a sidebar because the sole purpose that the users come into the contact form is we want them to actually fill out this contact form. So we don't want them to get sidetracked on additional links and so on. So really it's more optimized if we're not having those distractions, and that's what we typically would have within our page structure. So again, it's always depending on how we think it through and what we want to accomplish within our web pages. So let's go back into our CSS. So we know that we have set up our website. We've got a pretty decent structure here to the website, and now let's apply some additional styling into our web page. So first of all, we can take a look, and we've got the way that we usually build out styling is that we either go from where the different elements appear on the web page. We usually start with the default ones. So if we've got a particular style for body, we would include it there. And if we had our H1 tags, we wanted them a particular look and feel, we'd add those in, and so on. So if we wanted all of our links to look a certain way, this is where we would add that in. And then all of these ones, the reason we put these ones after is because we want the ability for these ones to overwrite the defaults, because the defaults are maybe not necessarily what we want within our web page. So things like images, making them more responsive, so we would include one for image, and we could do a max width of 100%. And also let's include some other stuff for the image that we can. So this will make the image more responsive within our containers. We can also include some padding. So I was going to say include some padding around that image. Because a lot of times you don't want your image touching right up against your text. So if you have a text and image together, you might not want them touching right up against each other. So this is just where we set all of our defaults here at the top. So next, what we want to do is we want to set up our main content area. So we did set up a frame. We've got the body, we've got the head. Sometimes you might want to also create a container div that wraps around all of them so you can control the width of your page. Again, depending on what your design is, you might want to create another div. So sometimes you'll see this type of div where we've got one called wrapper, and then basically the idea is that this is the entire wrapper for all of the code, and I go into my CSS, I can identify and I can call to wrapper, and I can give it a width. So if I want the width of the wrapper to be 1180 pixels, then we can set it that way, and this way we have all of that content is flowing and landing in the middle of that 1180 pix. So again, depending on how we want to utilize it, so maybe we want to do max width. So if we had some images and whenever the screen size gets too large, we don't want them to go all the way across, so we can really minimize how we want that output to look. So it's another thing that sometimes is included depending again how you're designing your website. We've already styled the navigation bar, and next let's go back into our index. And we've got a section and we've got aside. So for this, I generally will give these ones either classes or IDs, and maybe I can call this one main, and then this one will be sidebar. And this just gives me a way to identify them in the CSS. So if I've got my main content area and I've got my sidebar, now I can apply different styling to each one and make it look the way that I want it to look. So the main one, let's say for instance, I want it to be 70% of that content area, and I want sidebar to only hold 30% of the content area. Now let's make this actually a little bit smaller than what we would expect. So it wouldn't be 30%, it would be 25, because this will give us a little bit of a buffer between the two cells. And if we obviously if we go over 100%, our styling gets all messed up. So what we use as well when we are applying styling to pull different sections over into different areas, we use float. So float gives us the ability to float it left, float it right, or no floating. So we're going to float to the left, and then this one we're going to float it over to the right. And this is where the magic happens, because this gives us the ability to resize our web page. And I'm actually going to get rid of this max width of, well, I can resize my page there. So we can see that when I'm resizing, our dimensions are still working. And if I wanted to, maybe I want to add a background color to my sidebar. So background color, and we'll just pick a random color here. And maybe around my main content, I want to have some padding. And I also maybe want to have a border. And this is going to be a really, really light border around our content. See that the footer is actually sitting there, it's being pulled up, so we need to take care of that as well within the footer. So let's style our footer, and I'll show you what we can do with the footer in order to clear out the floats, because when you use floats you need to clear those. Sometimes you'll see within the CSS, just as the defaults, we've got a class called clear, and this is just used to clear out both of the floats. Because by default this footer is still trying to float because it doesn't have any additional instructions. So now if I go down to the footer, and if I do class, and if I clear the floats, because notice that it came right after the sidebar, so I need to clear out that float, moves it to the bottom. Now I can continue to style out that footer, and let's give it an ID of footer, which just makes it easier to identify it within my style. And footer, and let's give it a width of 100%. Do a background color, and maybe we'll just make a black background. Height, do a really big fat footer, minimum height of 200. So now we should also add in color. So just do the color font. So we've got an option to align the text. So I want to align the text centered. I'll do padding top. So I don't want it sitting right up at the top, so I'll do 30 pixels of padding. And now we can see we're getting more and more what looks like an actual website. So depending on what we want to style it, we could continue to add styling and really build out our website and our content area. So we've got our contact there, we've got our About Me page, and we've got the index. So let's go back into the index page, and I'm going to copy out this About Me section, because I don't want to always just reuse what I have in the About Me. So let's update this. And again, if you have to customize stuff per page, it's sometimes easier to do this depending again how you're presenting that content. So we might want this one to float over, be in line with the text. So we need to give it an ID or a class, and we've got some content there. So maybe this image, we don't want it just sitting outside. We've got that image in there, and I'm going to get rid of the different divs and get rid of the different sections, and so that will give us all of that content in one. Let's apply some styling over to this image. So I'm going to go back over here, and just where I had that clear, I'm going to add in float of left and float of right, and this gives me the ability to really easily add those floats in. So I'm going to float it to the left, and I'm going to float it to the right. And you don't have to do it this way. You can do it, you can customize it as needed as well. So always it depends on what your design calls for. There's really no right or wrong way to do it. There's just a number of different ways of doing this. So I'm going to apply a class, and you can apply multiple classes. So about img. So that's another class that I want to apply. So now go back over into the styling and class about img, and I'm going to give this one a width of 100 pixels because I want this image to be really small, and I want to float in line to the right of the text, so we can see how both of those classes are being used here. So maybe I want to do 200 pixels. So notice that it's still keeping that border from the previous class, but we set the image over here max 100. But for this particular image, we've added in some additional styling. And again, depending on how we want to use this, we've got a number of different options here for outputting and utilizing our content. So another thing that I'm just looking at right now is that our navigation bar is running a little bit long. So always whenever you're designing websites, there's always tweaks to do and updates. So in the next lesson, we're going to finish this off. We're going to wrap it up, and we're going to create some additional updates to the navigation bar. So that's coming up in the next lesson. So this lesson, we're going to do some tweaks to our website and our web page content. So notice that we've been building out this website, and the navigation bar isn't quite right. We can resize, and everything looks pretty good, but some of the stuff just is not working properly. So let's update this width to be 100%. And so now we're going to use 100%, but it's still not styling right. So that's 100%. So these list items, maybe they need to be 22%. So that way that gives us more flexibility in building up how our navigation looks. The really neat thing about CSS is you can also apply different styling depending on the size of the page. So we see here that as we're shrinking down, well, our navigation isn't quite right. So we probably have to change the size of the font or something else in order to make it more accommodating to the different screen sizes. So we can actually use media queries in order to determine what the size of the screen is. So we can do something like media screen, and when it's a max width of 500 pixels, then we can apply this styling to it. So let's just add something in here quickly. So now whenever we are over, so see how it goes. So whenever we're shrinking under 500 pixels, we see that we get a different background color. So that's how the media queries work. And remember, this is again zoomed in. So the 100% is there, so 500 pixels is there. So whenever we shrink below that 500 pixels, then we're getting a different look and feel. And now, although the navigation bar isn't too bad, we still need to make maybe some updates to it that in order to better accommodate that navigation bar. So we can do things where we can change the font size if we want, or a whole bunch of different options here that we have available to us. So let's actually update. So whenever we shrink it down, we're going to rewrite some of this content here for our navigation bar. So Let's go back over to here. We see we've got all of these set at 0. So line height is 40. So that's maybe not the best option for us. So let's make this look a little bit neater. And I'm going to just rewrite this part here. So usually this is what I do. I'll just copy and paste it out. And then I'll remove out what I don't need to change and leave what I do need to change. And then maybe change that line height to 20. So let's see what happens now. So when I shrink it down, so my line height changes. So maybe this is a little bit more accommodatable within our resizing. I want to also get rid of this red color. So maybe I just get rid of this border altogether. And that's something that we can do there when we hover over it. And now when we shrink it down, so we've got a more usable format, but we see that this one still is not resizing properly. And this is what I mean by tweaking it, because sometimes you just got to take it and look at it and eyeball it and see how things are working out. So maybe the problem here is the main and the sidebar, that these percentages are no longer working out to be 100%. So we need to make better accommodation on the smaller size screen. And maybe if this one is going when at the smaller screen, instead of doing 50%, we'll do 100%, and we'll just do a float none and float none, and we'll remove out the padding, and we don't need to update the borders or the background colors. So let's go take a look at this now. So now whenever we resize it, this one, they actually stack. So we see that these two elements, they stack one on top of the other, and you'll see this a lot when you're looking at mobile size screens, that they do that stacking. So we also see that our image isn't exactly 100%, so for some reason it's hanging slightly out. So maybe we need to do an update on that, because we've got that padding on the images. So we need to get rid of the padding on the image, and that's what's causing that overhang. So just change that to 0%, and that will get rid of any of that overhanging image part. So when we resize it, it fits in nicely into our div. And we can see that it works on multiple sizes as well. I can go to About, I can see that everything is working properly, Contact, and so on. And then of course Google will just link out to another page. So maybe now I can actually get rid of this part of the body. And I'll just leave that in there for now, because sometimes you might want to be adjusting the way your web page looks depending on the size. And that's really it. It just takes some more time to kind of work with your content. I noticed as well that I've got some padding up here at the top that I probably want to, or a margin that I want to get rid of. So I can just click here on Inspect. This is how you can use your browser in order to determine where this excess padding is coming from. So it's not coming from there. And do an inspect there. And I believe this is probably coming from that frame. So maybe we need to make an adjustment on the frame as well. So we're setting a default height for that frame. So let's find that frame and make an adjustment to that one as well. So the nav frame, so we've got that height of 80. So let's get rid of that. And we'll just do, maybe we want to do a height of 40 or 30 and see if that looks a little bit better. So yeah, that turns out a little bit nicer. We still need to make some adjustments because we've got that frame and then we've got the navigation in there, and maybe we want to do overflow hidden on that. And see where this is coming from. So this is coming from the nav frame. So we've got overflow hidden. So that's being overwritten by another element. So let's take a look at the nav bar. And maybe we need to conclude in here as well, overflow hidden. So that will take care of some of that scrolling. And as I said, it does take a little bit of time to play around with it, especially because we've included that iframe. So you can see that there are sometimes more difficulties when you do have that iframe. But again, it depends on what you need and what your styling is for your website. And always test it out at 100%. Chrome actually has a really neat tester here where you can toggle the device toolbar, so we can set the different widths for it, so we can see what it looks like on a 600 pic device. We can see what it looks like on an iPhone 6. We can see what it looks like on Galaxy. So we've got all of these options within Chrome when we're developing websites to really customize that output and get it looking the way that we want it to look within our web page. Within any website, there's always that fine-tuning in order to get it right and looking and feeling the way that you want to present your content. So take some time, play around with it, make some updates within the styling, and see what you can do within your CSS to make that website look the way that you want it to look. This lesson, I want to show you how you can update your fonts within your website really easily. And there's a great resource for this over at Google Fonts. So they have several hundred fonts, 808 at the time when I'm recording this video, and you can really easily sift through any of these fonts and use them within your web pages. And it's going to be so super simple to do. So the first step, pick the font that you want to use. So for instance, if I want to use this one, I've got it selected. I can pick it up, and I have two options to import the font. So I can link to it as just a regular style sheet and then make use of it within my style sheet, keeping in mind that if you do it within this type of format, make sure that you link to it before you link to your own style sheet. Otherwise, your style sheet won't know what this font family is. And you can also import it directly into your style sheet. So this is my preferred method of bringing into styles, and especially because I've got this one style sheet across multiple web pages, it just really simplifies this process that I could do an import of the style sheet, and then I can make use of it within my projects. So I can really quickly, as easily as this, update my font family, go back out to my website project and refresh it, and now I see I'm taking advantage of that brand new font that Google had provided within their web page. And it's as easy as that to update fonts. Of course, you can update fonts on your various elements as well and be very specific. You can select one font, you can select multiple fonts. If you want to change your fonts, it's as easy as this to change your fonts. So we can do indie. So notice that the import path changes. So if I'm using both of them, I can just simply import it there, and then I can make use of it within font family just as I did previously, and just simply click it like that, go back out to my page, and right away all of my fonts change. And this is how I can make use of all the different fonts that are available at Google Fonts. So this was just a quick tip in order to check out some new resources that are available online in order to help you build web pages quicker and easier.